Chapter 2260. Hearing Bai Jian's words. Everyone's expression became even more sorrowful at this moment. It could be said that this was what Li Fengmu had been worried about all along. Bai Jian's breakthrough could be said to be high-spirited. Even the 3,000 flying swords in one hand stunned everyone. However, it was also because of that reason that he failed to advance to the next realm. For a sword cultivator, a breakthrough in the middle of a battle was something that could only be chanced upon by luck, especially when facing an enemy. However, the worst situation still happened. It could even be said to be a situation that should not have happened. That was Bai Jian was unable to take the last step, so he failed. A sword cultivator's opportunity came and went quickly. After leaving, there would be even more obstacles left behind. Of course, this was the most terrifying blow to one's mind. In other words, it would be very difficult for Bai Jian to break through again in the future. He might even be trapped in this realm for the rest of his life, unable to advance any further. In their hearts, they were all very clear about the seriousness of this matter. It seems like it's true. Bai Jian's tone became very downcast at this moment. At this time, Bai Jian's state of mind had also become extremely terrible. It could even be said that it was dead silent. Who would have thought that he would actually encounter the worst situation? Who present did not feel sorry for him? Among the younger generation of Sword Heart World, only Bai Jian had the highest talent and current achievements. However, now that his future seemed to have been completely destroyed, how could people not sigh and feel sorry for him? Bai Jian, this is a small matter. There's no need to take it to heart, Li Fengmu advised with a smile. Li Chuanyi also nodded firmly and said, Senior brother, with your ability, you will definitely be able to break through in no time. For a moment, everyone also began to comfort him. What they were worried about was that Bai Jian would be unable to recover from this setback. Although Bai Jian's future might have been sealed if he did not try, it would never be possible. When Bai Jian heard these words, it was as if needles were piercing his heart, causing him great pain. That terrifyingly arrogant youth had completely changed now. After a long time, Bai Jian grinned and said, It's just a small matter. It's not worth mentioning. When the crowd heard this, they were unable to feel happy. The reason for that was because his tone was extremely calm. There was not the slightest bit of fluctuation in his tone. It was as if Bai Jian had already given up, but he had no choice but to say such words to make them feel at ease. The elders present were in tears. They had all watched Bai Jian walk up step by step, but who would have thought that they would encounter such a situation? There is no need to deceive yourself. I believe that with your nature, you shouldn't be like this. After speaking, Princess Mingzhu turned around and left. Now, Bai Jian's performance had disappointed Princess Mingzhu. Coincidentally, she had sensed the auras of blind left and blind right, so she decided to vent her anger on them. At this moment, Li Fengmu's heart was filled with mixed feelings. He even felt that his death in the Western Plains was not important. However, the one who was sacrificed in the end was Bai Jian. How could he accept that? In Li Fengmu's eyes, he was just a piece of rotten wood that couldn't go far. However, Bai Jian was different. He was still young and could even take the Sword Heart World further. Fate was truly toying with him. Everyone, please go back. I'm a little tired, Bai Jian said indifferently. Li Fengmu and the others wanted to say something, but hesitated. Seeing that Bai Jian had already laid down and closed his eyes, they did not dare to continue. Now, Bai Jian's state of mind was relatively fragile. Sometimes, words of comfort might become a flood that broke through his already shattered state of mind. It could even be said that the only person who could help Bai Jian now was himself. However, they were also worried. Could it be that they could leave just like that without asking about him? Was this approach appropriate? Everyone exchanged a few glances and immediately walked out of the room. After leaving the room, Li Fengmu looked at the scorching sun high in the sky and suddenly felt a little dizzy. Sword Master, what should we do? An elder sighed and asked. Li Fengmu could only smile bitterly and shake his head. He had also watched Bai Jian grow up, so he understood Bai Jian better. No matter what he said now, it might make him feel even more uncomfortable, or even completely shatter his state of mind. That was all possible. There's nothing we can do. Li Fengmu smiled bitterly. The past few days of peace made Xiao Yang feel very bored. At the same time, he would also observe the movements of the White Bear army. He also realized that they seemed to have nothing to do every day and did not seem to be plotting anything. So what exactly were they planning? This made Xiao Yang somewhat puzzled. As such, the more he could not see through it, the more anxious he became. At this moment, an old man walked up and stood in front of Xiao Yang. Xiao Yang looked at him with a puzzled gaze. The old man suddenly cupped his fists and bowed. This old man took advantage of his seniority and did not listen to orders. I almost caused the Spring Sun garrison to be wiped out. Please punish me, Leader Xiao. Ji Fei glanced at him and stared at him with interest. He wanted to know what the old prime minister was trying to do. Bring a bramble and ask for punishment? Xiao Yang immediately helped the old prime minister up and said, "Let's forget about this matter for now. It's good that you're alive." He said this indifferently, but the old prime minister was mocking himself in his heart. He had always thought that these young people were just slightly more talented and did not have much foresight. He also thought that they did not know much about battle formations. However, the ignorant person was himself. This time, it's all thanks to Leader Zhao's help that I can continue living, the old prime minister said with a bitter smile. Xiao Yang shook his head and said, "The grudge between us has been settled long ago. Why do you have to take it to heart? We're allies now, so we should help each other." He said this casually as if it was a matter of course. After hearing this, the old prime minister blamed himself in his heart. This was because he felt that his previous view was too narrow-minded. He had always thought that Xiao Yang would definitely use his power to avenge private grudges. Now that he thought about it, he was just gauging the heart of a gentleman with his own mean measure. Suddenly, the old prime minister laughed heartily and felt very carefree. To be able to meet someone like Xiao Yang, who could settle grudges without any hesitation or delay, such a person could be said to be a gentleman and worth befriending. Such an ally was even more trustworthy. Chapter 2261. It's my good fortune to be able to meet a spiritual master like Lord Xiao. This time I should kill 3 in a row. That would be great, the old prime minister said happily. However, Xiao Yang immediately poured a bucket of cold water on him. "If you don't think your situation is bad enough, then go ahead. I won't stop you." The old prime minister was choked to the point that he couldn't say a word. He felt very uncomfortable. Previously, he thought that Xiao Yang was a straightforward person. Why did he change so quickly and start choking him? Ji Fei, who was standing at the side, snickered. This stubborn old thing, he didn't expect that he would be ridiculed and not dare to retort. It should be known that the old prime minister had the guts to take advantage of his seniority, even in front of the God Emperor. Now, the old prime minister was at a loss of what to do. It seemed that whatever he said now would be a little pale and powerless. Xiao Yang's gaze was still fixed on the tent 50 miles away. His enemy was there, so he had to be careful. All this time, another third-order martial emperor expert had stayed in West Wind City without moving an inch. This made Xiao Yang a little worried. What exactly was he planning? Moreover, in the past few days, several teams had entered the camp one after another, constantly expanding their strength. However, their motionless posture was somewhat puzzling to the onlookers. There was still a difference between his current attitude and his previous impatience. Xiao Yang also thought of counterattacking, but because Princess Mingzhu hadn't returned yet, he could only give up on this idea. After all, sometimes there was a price to pay for impulsiveness. Since the other party was still seeking stability even when they had an absolute advantage, how could Xiao Yang dare to advance rashly? Suddenly, a person rose from the ground in the tent and rushed over quickly. However, it was only him. The person who came was Bailey Z. He stopped in front of Pine Victory Mountain and looked down at the entire mountain range. The smile at the corner of his mouth became wider. "It seems that you have rested well these few days," Bailey Z said with a smile. When Xiaoyang heard this, he frowned slightly. He did not know what Bailey Z was planning. However, because he didn't leave even half a step, Xiaoyang couldn't leave either. "You guys have indeed allowed us to rest well these few days," Xiaoyang replied with a smile. Xiaoyang was quite clear about this person's thoughts. He was just using a little psychological attack. However, because of their vigilance, they were indeed a little tired in the first 1 or 2 days. However, after good coordination, this situation naturally disappeared. Bailey Z nodded his head in satisfaction and said, "That's good. As long as you can recuperate well, you will be able to perform exceptionally well in future battles." Xiaoyang also nodded with a smile, as if tacitly agreeing with this. However, it's hard to say what will happen next. After all, our warriors have sharpened their swords over the past few days. Who knows, they might attack today, tonight, or tomorrow, Bailey Z said with a smile. Everyone's faces changed when they heard this. However, Bailey Z's tone was very relaxed, as if he was talking about daily life. "You're welcome any time. If you don't come any later, I'm afraid our swords will rust," Xiaoyang retorted. The old Prime Minister looked at the Almighty, who had broken Chunyang City's array formation single-handedly and had beaten him to a pulp. He was speechless when he heard the Almighty's nonsensical words. What's going on? Or is there a problem with the temperament of these Almighties? However, the old Prime Minister was still unsure of what exactly was going on, so he felt very helpless. "That's good. We might as well wait for a few more days. Wouldn't it be easier to attack when your weapons are rusted?" Bailey Z said with a laugh. Xiaoyang was also helpless in the face of this Almighty's shamelessness. After the two of them talked for a while, Bailey Z returned to the array formation without any intention of attacking. The old Prime Minister was dumbfounded. He suddenly felt that there was something wrong with the brains of these Almighties from the realm of beasts. The battle between two armies was a serious matter, yet he had come over to talk about daily life. It was really unreasonable. Moreover, wasn't this method a little too childish? At least, this was still somewhat unacceptable to the old Prime Minister. However, Xiaoyang was still as calm as ever. It was as if nothing had happened. This gave the old Prime Minister a headache. Could it be that the atmosphere of the 3,000 medium worlds was very different from that of the small worlds? Even if they were mortal enemies, they could still get along harmoniously without the slightest hostility? "It seems that this guy is not prepared to give us a peaceful life," Ji Fei said with a bitter smile. Soldiers were cunning. Previously, Bailey Z had said that he was going to attack, but it had been peaceful all along. Now that he was going to attack again, the probability of him attacking was probably very high. It could be said that this was a psychological battle. It was a battle to see who had a stronger heart and could endure this tactic. Xiaoyang also nodded with a smile. "Then we'll have to work harder these days." Ji Fei was also helpless. Although he had been taking turns with Xiaoyang these days, he felt that if this continued, it wouldn't be a problem. They lived every day on tenterhooks, afraid that the other party would suddenly attack. It could be said that this method was very torturous for them. That's not a problem, but how long will this situation last? Ji Fei asked softly. It could be said that this was the problem that Ji Fei was most concerned about. If this went on for too long, the final result would only be physical and mental exhaustion. In the end, once the polar bear army launched an attack, it wouldn't be a good thing for them to face the enemy in a fatigued state. Therefore, how to deal with this matter had become an extremely difficult problem. Xiaoyang also fell into deep thought because of this problem. This was indeed something that needed to be carefully assessed. They couldn't continue like this. Although there was a rotation system, it was still not enough. After all, they had a sharp spirit in a short period of time, and once the spirit was worn down, the consequences would be unimaginable. In this way, Xiaoyang also understood that Beilizi's method was to attack their hearts. What he wanted was for them to be in fear every day and be fully on guard. He would then attack when they were exhausted. Chapter 2262. Since things had already developed to this point, there was nothing they could do. They could only continue like this. After all, it had always been a mystery when the opponent would make a move. No one could say for sure. Therefore, they could only be careful. In the following days, Xiaoyang and Ji Fei also kept an eye on the opponent's movements at the peak of the mountain to prevent any mistakes. Sometimes they could even see the white bear warriors singing and dancing, eating meat and drinking wine. It could be said that they were very happy. Where were the signs of an impending battle? Even these supplies were being transported in an endless stream, which made them even more satisfied in terms of material goods. Moreover, their numbers were increasing every day, but there was no sign of a battle at all. Such torturous days made some of the Alliance soldiers feel even more tormented. If they were to start a battle directly, they would really feel that it was nothing. However, it was uncomfortable to be left hanging like this. Moreover, it was also difficult to accept, but they could only keep it in their hearts. Every few days, Bailizi would come alone to talk to Xiaoyang. In between his words, he would talk about some trivial things. Of course, more of it was about preparing to fight and words of condolence. Obviously, Bailizi was completely immersed in the tactics of torturing the opponent's mentality and could not extricate himself from it. He was even using it to the point of perfection. Xiaoyang was also aware of this, so he treated it with a normal heart. However, not everyone in the alliance could maintain their mentality in a good state of mind like Xiaoyang. In fact, some of the warriors almost could not take it anymore. If the old prime minister had not personally stepped in to suppress them, perhaps the entire alliance would have been discouraged because of the psychological collapse of a small number of people. Not to mention other things, the old prime minister's authority and right to speak in the realm of the gods were still very useful. Moreover, some problems were solved with just a few words from him. It could be said that this was the reason why the realm of the gods sent the old prime minister over. Because of the old prime minister's high prestige, many people were convinced by him. Many unnecessary troubles could be solved as long as he stepped in. However, there was still no news from the realm of the gods, which made people extremely worried. As for Bai Jian's matter, Xiaoyang also felt that it was a pity after learning about it. At the same time, he also felt that Bai Jian would not admit defeat so easily. His current state might be a little dispirited, but it was probably only temporary. One day, if he wanted to take another step forward, he would be able to do so. However, due to blind left and blind right's harassment, it was difficult for Princess Mingzhu to free herself. She could only guard the flowing cloud world. Although Princess Mingzhu and Li Fengmu had worked together to kill blind left and blind right, they had failed in the end. These two people could be said to be very cunning. Once the situation was not right, they would immediately retreat. Sometimes, as long as Princess Mingzhu arrived, they would leave. This method was like a disease that was difficult to eradicate. However, you have to pay more attention. The moment Princess Mingzhu left, the two of them would immediately surround and attack Li Fengmu. At that time, if Li Fengmu was defeated, the consequences would be unimaginable. It could be said that both Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu had their own misgivings. Thus, it was difficult for them to meet up in a short period of time. They could only allow the battle to continue. It was a stalemate without any progress. On this day, the world spirit contacted Xiaoyang again. The aura of the person in West Wind City has completely disappeared. I don't know where he went, the world spirit said. Hearing this, Xiaoyang frowned slightly. He also began to search quickly, wanting to find the other party. However, the result was somewhat helpless. That person seemed to have disappeared from the world and could not be found at all. I think the other party used some method to deliberately hide his aura. Even I can't find him. I'm afraid the grade of the weapon is not bad, the world spirit said with a bitter smile. The other party had disappeared in his world without him knowing. This also gave Xiaoyang a headache. Therefore, he also felt that this matter was not so simple. How was it possible for a third-order martial emperor to disappear just like that? And the other party deliberately kept a low profile. He was probably planning something. Thinking of this, Xiaoyang also felt that there was a sense of a coming storm. The other party had been silent for so long. It was impossible that he did not have any plans. Therefore, what the other party was planning was still a mystery. It shouldn't be, Xiaoyang muttered to himself. The world spirit nodded and said, logically speaking, it is indeed so. However, as long as he is in the drifting cloud world and reveals a trace of his aura, I can capture it. This was not an exaggeration. After all, the drifting cloud world was controlled by the world spirit. The other party was in its territory, so it was naturally difficult for him to escape from its eyes. However, he was indeed a little careless to disappear this time. Of course, the main reason was that Xiaoyang had placed his attention on by Li Zi, which was why he had miscalculated. As such, Xiaoyang had no choice but to reconsider his options. I just hope that he has something to do, and left. Otherwise, if he sneaks in, the consequences will be unpredictable, Xiaoyang sighed and said. The world spirit nodded slightly. She also understood that if the other party caused trouble behind the scenes, the consequences would be extremely terrifying. However, the prerequisite for the other party to make a move was to use power. In this way, he would naturally be exposed. Regarding this war, I do have an opinion, the world spirit said. Xiaoyang was stunned for a moment, then he smiled and nodded. Since the other party is surrounding us but not attacking, we don't have to be anxious. Even if Princess Mingzhu returns, we don't have to be in a hurry to launch a counterattack. We can just stay in a stalemate, the world spirit said with a smile. If such words were heard by the Alliance army, they would probably say that such an idea was despicable. However, Xiaoyang thought about it carefully. Since the world spirit said so, it meant that there was a reason behind it. Moreover, such a stalemate did not result in any losses or casualties between the two sides. Moreover, the drifting cloud world only lost the western defense line built by the West Wind City and the Spring Sun City. However, because they lost decisively, they seem to have only lost some peripheral territories. I remember that there is a saying called raising an enemy for self-respect, and we also need time. If we can continue to drag it out, why not? The world spirit said decisively after thinking about it. Chapter 2263. Hearing this, Xiaoyang's eyes lit up. Although the world spirit's words were a little troublesome, it was very suitable for the current situation. If they continued in this stalemate, it could be said that both sides would not suffer too much loss. Moreover, as long as the White Bear tribe was not defeated, they would definitely not ask for reinforcements. Therefore, in this way, they would still be facing the White Bear tribe and not the army of the Beast Realm. Xiaoyang smiled. If they could delay the time like this, it would be a good plan. After all, they still had to wait until the Emperor God broke through to the 4th level Martial Emperor realm. Only then would he have the right to speak. However, how long they had to wait was still a huge problem. Therefore, no matter how they looked at it, the only thing they could do now was to continue to delay. How to delay was also a technical job. If the opponent sensed that something was wrong, the final result would be very bad. This gave Xiaoyang a headache. This matter did not need to be done deliberately, but there were some small details that were difficult to ignore. Therefore, they had to be careful. Understood. Xiaoyang smiled indifferently. The world spirit also smiled and nodded. Since they could figure out the key point, everything was no longer a problem and could be solved well. If he kept hesitating, that would be the worst-case scenario. In the end, they would even implicate themselves. It was very clear how to choose. It could even be said that they had no way out. Don't worry. I will try my best to find the missing person. Once there is news, I will inform you immediately, the world spirit said. Hearing this, Xiaoyang nodded his head slightly. Soon after, his mind returned to his body. In front of them was still the army of the White Bear tribe, but they had been there for a long time without the slightest movement, which was a little strange. Although he had already decided on the strategy of keeping the enemy for himself, the opponent was too calm. There must be a reason behind this abnormality. Xiao Yang couldn't help but feel a little helpless as he wondered what his opponent was plotting. It seemed that no matter how much he thought about it, coupled with the information he had obtained, it was difficult for him to figure out the other party's intentions. In addition, the leader of the White Bear tribe had disappeared for no reason. This made Xiao Yang even more worried. What's going on here? The more he thought about it, the more his head hurt. He felt that this matter was a little unreasonable. What are you worried about? Ji Fei asked doubtfully when he saw Xiao Yang's worried face. Xiao Yang shook his head. I can't sense the great expert in West Wind City. Ji Fei's expression changed drastically when he heard this. Naturally, he knew how terrifying the severity of this matter was. Furthermore, his opponent's actions were enough to cause others to feel fear. No wonder it had been peaceful recently, and Bailey Z had provoked him many times but did not take action. This made him feel a little strange. But now it seemed that things were not that simple. Perhaps an even bigger conspiracy had already begun to brew. It was just that they were unaware of it. It seems that all the peace is just an illusion. Ji Fei smiled bitterly. He also felt that there was nothing he could do about this matter. But what could he do? It seemed that he could only wait and see. It was difficult to do anything. But there's no need to think too much. It would be a big mistake if you mess up your position. Xiao Yang took a deep breath and expressed his thoughts. Ji Fei smiled and nodded when he heard this. There was naturally no need to doubt this point. The premise of everything was to be calm. Of course, this could also be the opponent deliberately setting up a formation to mislead them, to make them use more thoughts to guess. In this way, if they thought too much, they would definitely make mistakes in some areas. Once there was a flaw in the seemingly perfect defensive line, a small tear might be infinitely enlarged. In the end, it would be difficult to repair it. But we still have to be careful. Why don't we go to the God realm to ask for reinforcements and send 2 more Almighties? Ji Fei thought for a while and said, it could be said that now that the flowing cloud world had an ally from the God realm, they might not be inferior to the other party in terms of soldiers. What they really didn't want to enter was the number of top-notch experts. If the number of experts was equal, it would be enough to fight with the White Bear tribe. Xiao Yang shook his head and said, no. However, one must know that in order to ensure the safety of their allies, the God realm had already divided their forces into 3 different worlds to guard them. If they were to send more people over, then the headquarters of the God realm would most likely become extremely empty. Ji Fei heard and did not continue to speak. After all, there was not much meaning in talking too much about this matter. Since Xiao Yang did not have such thoughts, they could only take one step at a time and see how things go. After the 2 talked for a while, Xiao Yang began to survey the entire flowing cloud world with the convenience of the heart of the world, to search for the missing Almighty. Although the world spirit was also doing its best to search, there was a limit to one person's strength and energy. There might be a mistake somewhere, and it would be difficult to find. With one more person, there would naturally be one more insurance. However, Xiao Yang did not find any clues, even after looking at all the places he was looking at. As for the West Wind City, there was already a formation set up by others. It was not impossible to spy on it, but it would be difficult to avoid being discovered in the end. After thinking about it, Xiao Yang did not force to investigate to avoid unnecessary trouble, and Ji Fei stood there in fear and trepidation, continuing to observe the big tent 50 miles away. More than 10 days passed, and it was still calm, and every few days, Bailey Z would come over to say a few words, but it was nothing more than some provocation and threats. But he had never made a move. This made it even more difficult for people to figure it out, and they began to doubt it, because their actions were indeed very suspicious, and it was necessary to be more careful. It was just that the trace of the Almighty was still not found. On this night, Xiaoyang suddenly opened his eyes and looked at the tent in front of him, and a smile appeared on his face. Chapter 2264. Looks like they can't hold back any longer and are ready to start their invasion, Xiaoyang said with the corners of his mouth raised slightly. Ji Fei was stunned when he heard that. However, all he saw was silence in front of him. It did not seem to have changed much compared to before. Ji Fei was also puzzled and asked, "Could they be invisible?" "Their target this time is our flanks, not our front. Just now, 2 groups of people snuck out and headed towards our flanks," Xiaoyang said, shaking his head. Moreover, they were 2 rank, 2 martial emperors. Therefore, Xiaoyang was not in a hurry and did not take any action. Shen Wushuang and Chu Nanfeng had the support of the formation, so they might be able to fight them. At the very least, it would be difficult for them to break the formation and sneak in based on their abilities. At that moment, Xiaoyang had thought of attacking and killing the 2 of them with lightning speed. However, he rejected the idea in the end. Since he had implemented the strategy of keeping the enemy as his own, he could not kill them. After all, once 2 rank, 2 martial emperors were killed, Bailizi's mentality might change. However, if he played along with them now, he could still buy some time. As for how long this stalemate and disturbance would last, he had no idea. "If that's the case, I'll guard this place. Master Xiao, with your ability, I'm afraid it won't take long for you to kill all of them," Ji Fei said with a smile. After holding back for so long, the enemy had finally made their move. Moreover, in Ji Fei's opinion, this was a relatively stupid method. Was this not a great opportunity for them to take them down one by one? However, when Ji Fei saw Xiaoyang shaking his head and looking indifferent, Ji Fei was stunned on the spot. At this moment, Ji Fei also felt that the atmosphere seemed to be a little off. He did not know if he was too sensitive or if he did not think of the master's worries. "If I leave, I'm afraid Bailizi will attack immediately." Xiaoyang saw that Ji Fei was hesitating, so he casually made up an excuse. Hearing this, Ji Fei's expression became much better. If Xiaoyang had other plans, it would make people doubt his intentions. However, it made sense. At their level, it was normal for them to be able to sense each other's location. Moreover, Bailizi had been keeping a low profile these days, so people couldn't help but wonder what was going on. The more he thought about it, the more doubts he had. Then, Ji Fei stopped thinking about it and stared at the enemy camp. Tonight was destined to be a sleepless night. He still needed to be careful. Moreover, their opponents had already begun to harass them from both sides. When the time came, they would use this to attract their attention. In the end, it was even possible for them to launch a frontal assault. Xiaoyang sat there, unmoving like a mountain. It was as if he had already predicted everything, which was why he was so calm. As for whether the 2 teams would invade the flanks or the rear, Xiaoyang had already thought about it. If it was just an invasion, there was no need for him to care. If they were harassing Ji Hao's rear, Ji Hao would make the first move and kill all the non-humankind beings who had bypassed Victory Mountain. He already had a plan in mind, so naturally there was no need for him to worry about anything else. This night was destined to be a sleepless one. This was because the flames of war had been ignited on both the flanks of Summit Victory Mountain. Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang led their troops to attack the flanks of Summit Victory Mountain. Since Unrivaled God and Chu Nanfeng were both supported by formations, they were evenly matched with their opponents. Their opponents did not gain the slightest advantage from the battle. This battle lasted for a full hour before it ended. It seemed that when Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang's strength was almost depleted, they retreated decisively and tacitly. This night, all the sergeants who were in rotation were on standby. This was because they knew very well that such an invasion might just be the beginning. Perhaps when the 2 Almighties had almost recovered, they would come back and attack again. Fortunately, there was only one invasion that night. At dawn the next day, Chu Nanfeng began to curse. It was his first time fighting such an aggrieved battle. However, With Xiao Yang's clear orders, they were all stationed at their original positions. Without thinking too much, they could only suppress the anger in their hearts. At noon the next day, Bailizi came, riding on the wind again. This time Bailizi's face was full of joy, as if he had gained something good. He was overjoyed. The moment he saw Bailizi, Ji Fei was so angry that he gritted his teeth. If this person had not used these tricks, why would they be on tenterhooks every day? You seem to be in low spirits. Looks like last night's skirmish didn't let you rest well, Bailizi said with a grin. There was a blatant mockery in his words. After saying those words, Bailizi had a happy and contented appearance. It was as if he was very satisfied with his hands. Looks like you guys are just SOSO. You made such a big fuss, but it was all bark and no bite. Xiao Yang also laughed disdainfully and mocked them. Bailizi, on the other hand, looked like a villain who had succeeded and was laughing nonstop. He felt very comfortable when he saw how these people were constantly on tenterhooks and prepared to fight at any moment. Indeed, it was refreshing to fight with brute force, but it was too brainless. However, sometimes one only needed to use one's brain to change the situation drastically and torture one's opponent until they broke down. Attacking one's mind was the most effective method. It was indeed comfortable to use this method. Now, Bailizi also felt that the method that Mr. Bai had given him was indeed useful. Although Bailizi was the one who had come up with this method, Mr. Bai was the one who had decided on how to proceed. Even though it had been more than a month since they had arrived. So what? To their long lifespan, this amount of time was just a drop in the ocean. It was nothing. Other things aside, the war with the In-Flame realm had been going on for thousands of years. Even now they were still in a stalemate. Were they really in a hurry? It was not easy to obtain a world. Chapter 2265. Moreover, there were many things that could not be rushed, and they could only be done step by step. Perhaps they could achieve unexpected results if they spent more time. At the very least, they had exhausted their opponents without losing a single soldier. It did not seem like they had done much, but it was a huge and terrifying blow to the enemy's morale. Since you're so tired, I'll let you have a good night's sleep tonight. I won't make a move today. Bailizi pretended to be compassionate. After saying that, Bailizi turned around and left. Ji Fei looked at Xiao Yang. His mentality was also a little problematic. At the very least, he could not tolerate such a provocation. Even though the overall situation was in front of him, it was really difficult for him to accept such a sullen war. At least, that was the case for Ji Fei. Xiao Yang comforted him, then continued with his work, which was to search for that person's tracks. As for when he would be able to find that person, and whether he was still in the drifting cloud realm, it was uncertain. However, it was also because of this uncertainty that Xiao Yang had no choice but to pay more attention and carefully investigate. At midnight, Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang led their men and began to attack from both sides again. However, the number of people he brought this time was slightly more than the number of people he brought last night. This time, the attack only lasted for half an hour. Once the time was up, they quickly retreated and returned to their main camp. In the end, there was no more news. Over the next few days, Bailizi would come to Pinsheng Mountain one after another to speak to Xiao Yang. Of course, most of the time he would talk about the current situation in a sarcastic manner, or tell them that a wise man submits to circumstances and so on. In the end, there was nothing much to say, and he would just talk about some nonsense. Nevertheless, the attacks over the past few days were intermittent. Sometimes it was calm, and sometimes it was full of war. Due to the other party's actions, Xiao Yang and the others noticed that something was wrong. Bailizi's actions were far too frequent. What was his purpose in doing so? In this regard, Xiao Yang also had a bad premonition in his heart. He felt that Bailizi's frequent actions meant that he was trying to hide something. The only explanation for this was the Almighty who had disappeared. With this in mind, Xiao Yang had no choice but to be more cautious. As for the search, it seemed even more urgent. Unrivaled God and Chu Nanfeng. On the other hand, were unable to rest because of the nightly assault. If it was only once in a while, it wouldn't be a big deal. However, under such a high frequency of attacks, they were already a little tired. Chu Nanfeng, in particular, had a belly full of anger. However, because he was not strong enough and could only rely on formations to resist the enemy, he could only swallow his anger and did not dare to do anything. On the other hand, the divine realm warrior beside him also received a few harsh words from him. It was as if he was venting his anger. It was also because of the changes during this period that the army in the Pine Victory Mountain began to complain. They were not afraid of losing their lives in a real battle. However, now that he was holed up in the mountains and had to guard the place in fear every day, the torture on his mind was extraordinary. Although the old Prime Minister's appearance eased the situation, it did not help much. After all, they were patient in the beginning. However, as time passed, their patience was worn out. They were so impatient now that they were almost going crazy. These people have been a little ruthless lately. Many of our brothers can't stand the false words and attacks anymore, Ji Fei said through gritted teeth. In Ji Fei's opinion, the enemy was doing this to force them to take the initiative to attack and leave the Pine Victory Mountain that was protected by formations. It could also be said that the enemy was very wary of the power of the 10,000 Hearts Joint Effort Formation. However, they did not want to pay too high a price, so the only way was to make them take the initiative to attack. It was also because he had thought this through that Ji Fei felt so uncomfortable in his heart. Even if one understood the key points, what was the use of it? After all, it was not something that everyone could figure out. Even if they knew the truth, how many people would be able to adjust their mentality based on it? Even now, the army's morale was still unstable. If this went on, nobody knew what kind of trouble would happen. Ji Fei did not feel good about this either. In fact, the oppression now made him feel even more uncomfortable than when he was in the Divine Tomb. But now, they didn't have the ability to counterattack at all. They could only endure the humiliation. I don't know if they'll come again tonight, Ji Fei muttered and shook his head with a bitter smile. The enemy had been harassing the two flanks and did not take any action against the front, which made Ji Fei feel helpless. It was also because of this reason that some short-sighted people were even more resentful. Xiao Yang shook his head and said, "I'm not sure about that. But judging from the situation, they'll give themselves away sooner or later." After he finished speaking, Xiao Yang's eyebrows furrowed tightly together. This was because what he was worried about now was that his opponent would succeed before he could see through his opponent's plan. If that happened, their defense would start to crumble. In fact, they might not even be able to protect the drifting cloud boundary. Right now, Xiao Yang was starting to miss Princess Mingzhu. If he was here, he wouldn't have so many troubles. It was a pity that the two wolves, blind left and blind right, were too cunning. They had always adhered to the concept of guerrilla warfare. Once they sensed danger, they would immediately leave, not giving them a chance to fight head-on. Such a method could be said to be endlessly troublesome. The party that originally had an absolute advantage was now playing such a trick, which was even more troublesome. They were afraid that a boorish man had a meticulous mind, which was impossible to guard against. All of a sudden, Xiao Yang stood up and furrowed his eyebrows. At the same time, Ji Fei looked extremely serious. This was because they saw that Bailey Zi had personally taken action after such a long time. Moreover, they did not seem to be using the strategy of splitting up their forces to attack. Bolts of lightning rose from the tent one after another, heading towards the Taste Victory Mountain at an extremely fast speed. Previously, they were sneaky, but this time they were not hiding at all. Chapter 2266. Ji Fei immediately perked up. Even though he was a little tired, it was swept away at this moment. It could be said that the previous skirmishes were just small skirmishes. The two squads were only probing, and they did not intend to take over a certain area of exquisite Victory Mountain. They just wanted to make things difficult for them. Now, even the leader, Bai Lizi, had made a move, so the lineup was not small at all. At a glance, The army behind him was probably close to 1,000 people. For a war, 1,000 people were indeed not enough. However, the lowest cultivation base of each warrior was King Wu's rank 7, and they were considered elites. Such a terrifying lineup was in existence that could not be underestimated. Judging from the other party's actions, it could be seen that the previous skirmish was over. Tonight's attack was probably due to them taking advantage of the alliance's exhaustion. Although it was indeed strange for the opponent to launch such a large-scale attack, it was also reasonable. They had already done enough foreshadowing, so it was reasonable for them to wrap it up now. Ji Fei hurriedly gave a few orders, and the entire alliance began to move. Although Xiaoyang was also here, in order to ensure that nothing went wrong, they still had to take care of every detail. In fact, in Ji Fei's opinion, Xiaoyang was a trump card, and the later he made a move, the more advantageous it would be for them. If he could turn the pillar into a killing move, then the significance would be extraordinary. Xiaoyang looked up at the full moon and frowned slightly. At the same time, he began to ponder again. How should I explain this? Could it be that Bailizi couldn't control his nature and came to court his death? With that thought, Xiaoyang's questions began to surface one by one. However, he felt that Bailizi's large-scale attack this time was a little abrupt, and it was very different from his previous style. He suddenly made such a big change in strategy, and it was not as simple as a spur of the moment. There was probably a hidden conspiracy behind this. Thinking of this, Xiaoyang couldn't help but frown again. From the beginning to the end, he felt that this matter was not as simple as he had imagined. However, what was the opponent planning? Fight! Ji Fei shouted. His voice immediately resounded through the forest. All of a sudden, all of the allied cultivators who received the order were mobilized. Everyone's blood was boiling. After being suppressed for such a long time, they finally had a chance to fight back. They didn't have to continue being bullied. With this thought in mind, everyone's thoughts began to change. At the same time, they also realized that the outcome of the battle would be decided tonight. As for how the outcome would be determined, it was hard to say. After all, it was hard to say what was going on now. Ji Fei glanced at Xiaoyang. He took a deep breath and said, "What do you mean?" "I can't get too involved in the situation, or else I won't be able to extricate myself if something happens," Xiaoyang said in a low voice. Ji Fei nodded, but he quickly shook his head. After all, Bailizi had personally come this time. If Xiaoyang did not make a move, given Ji Fei's ability, it would be difficult for him to resist Bailizi's attack even with the help of the multi-hearts joint attack formation. Thinking of this, Ji Fei also felt very uncomfortable. The feeling of being led by the nose was very terrible. However, under such circumstances, they had no choice but to treat it with caution. After all, sometimes it was not just a matter of guarding a certain place. If more problems arose because they insisted on guarding the place, it would be terrible. In fact, they might lose more than they gained in the end. Given the situation, how could they not treat it with caution? "Leave it to me then. Just wait and see," Ji Fei said in a deep voice through gritted teeth. It was very difficult for him to deal with this person. However, he had to give it a try. After all, Xiaoyang could not really leave him in the lurch. Moreover, as the only top-notch combat power, Xiaoyang's agility could not be hindered. Moreover, if too many possibilities appeared in the war, a choice would have to be made. As for what to do, it would depend on Xiaoyang's strategy and his choice. In the blink of an eye, Bailizi led his men to form a formation at the foot of Victory Mountain. Bailizi was full of praise when he looked at the formation in front of him. "I have to admit that human cultivators' talents are beyond our reach. This formation is so ingenious that even after I asked you to probe it multiple times, you were unable to find any flaws," Bailizi said as he shook his head. Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang frowned when they heard him. During this period of time, they had indeed done a lot of probing, but the final result was greatly disappointing. They initially thought that if they could find some clues, it would naturally be much easier for them to attack this place. But until now, they had not been able to find any loopholes. Therefore, the only thing they could do was to attack by force. As for how many more casualties they would suffer if they attacked by force, it was still difficult to estimate. However, as long as their plan succeeded, it would be much easier for them to take down the drift cloud boundary in the future. Sometimes one had to pay a price when facing a brave and scheming world. As long as they could obtain more resources, it would be enough. Moreover, how could there be no deaths in a war? "Old brother, shall we scout the way first, or what?" Bai Ingfeng asked with a smile. The Bai clan and Bai Lizi's clans had always been at odds with each other and had secretly fought against each other. However, under the competition of interests, they were still able to work together. What did the previous grudges have to do with the battle formation? Bai Lizi shook his head and said, "I'll go fight Xiaoyang first. After I hold him back, you guys can find an opportunity to attack the formation. As long as you can hold him back, the people inside are just clay chickens and pottery dogs. Won't they be at our mercy?" From the beginning, Bai Lizi had regarded Xiaoyang as his only opponent, the stumbling block to taking down the drift cloud boundary. As long as he was gone, this world would naturally have no power to resist. Bai Ingfeng and Bai Liguang exchanged glances and nodded at each other. They had reached a tacit understanding. Then Bai Lizi flew up and hovered in the sky, looking down at the world. Chapter 2267. Xiaoyang, now that we've rested from the battle that we didn't finish, shouldn't we continue? Bai Lizi's lips curled up, and he shouted heroically. Now, Bai Lizi had specifically asked for Xiaoyang to fight. It was clear that he had already made a plan to take down the Taste Victory Mountain. He had probably deduced countless times and came up with the most advantageous method. Xiaoyang stood at the peak of the mountain. When he heard these words, the corners of his mouth curled into a smile. He never thought that Bai Lizi would be so bold. This made Xiaoyang even more certain that the attack this time was real and would be very fierce. However, at the same time, it was only a pretense. He was using the most powerful attack to cover his secret move. Perhaps Mr. Bai had never left the drifting cloud boundary. As for what exactly he was doing, that was something that no one knew. However, it would not take long for Bai Lizi's goal to be completely exposed. "Are you in such a hurry to die?" Xiaoyang immediately soared into the sky with the divine sword in his hand. Since he was going to fight Bai Lizi, he could not split his attention to deal with the others. Therefore, it was naturally the best choice to let Ji Fei control the formation. At the very least, it would not be easy to make a mistake. Ji Fei also understood that Xiaoyang did not use the formation's power, so he began to observe the situation below. "Haha, don't you feel embarrassed when you talk big? I wonder who was the one who was forced to flee in a sorry state last time. If it wasn't for the formation's protection, you would have almost lost your life," Bai Lizi said and laughed wildly. Although the previous battle had given Bai Lizi a rough idea of what was going on. However, he could not lose in terms of momentum. Moreover, he needed to use this method to create psychological pressure on his opponent. As long as he panicked, everything would be possible. "Did you eat garlic at night? Aren't you afraid of dying from the smell?" Xiaoyang sneered as he waved the divine sword in his hand. In terms of sarcasm, the two of them were evenly matched. They both wanted to use words to provoke each other, but their skills were similar. Therefore, they both maintained a playful state and wanted to tease each other. As for whose state of mind would be affected first, it was hard to say. However, as long as they tried, the result would naturally be revealed. "If possible, I'll eat more and suffocate you to death." "That doesn't seem like a bad idea," Bai Lizi said as he revealed his true colors. Bai Lizi's state of mind was very good. He could still tease Xiaoyang's provocation. This showed how powerful he was. Seeing that Bai Lizi's moods tea, he could not help but shake his head. It seemed like he could only fight with his strength. In the next moment, he attack. Xiaoyang's plan was very simple. He wanted to end the battle quickly. As long as he killed Bai Lizi quickly enough, then no matter what the person hiding in the dark was planning, he would still have time to stop it. It could be said that the one who was anxious in this battle was not Bai Lizi, but Xiaoyang. Xiao Yang's desire to kill his opponent was also very urgent. Bai Lizi seemed to have seen through his opponent's thoughts and immediately attacked. However, he held back every time he attacked, as if he was leaving himself a way out. At the same time, Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang understood each other's thoughts with just a glance. They revealed their true colors and attacked the formation. Ji Fei also began to respond. He borrowed the power of the formation and began to fight with them. Xiao Yang desperately wanted to kill Bai Lizi, but his fighting style was very conservative. He did not give Bai Lizi any chances. This made Xiao Yang even more anxious. This was because his opponent's actions seemed to be telling him that Bai Lizi was only doing this to tie him down. It was as if Bai Lizi had swaggered into the distant southern paradise just to tie Xiao Yang down. Thinking of this, Xiao Yang's heart was filled with discomfort. At the very least, this could not go on. He did not want to delay any longer and was ready to use his killing move. However, he realized that he could not form a sure-kill move. This made him feel helpless and could only endure. However, this kind of endurance was very taxing on his mind. Bai Lizi saw Xiao Yang's flustered and exasperated appearance and was extremely anxious. The smile on his face became even more smug. Everything was within his expectations. This guy's order was completely messed up. If he waited any longer, he would probably lose his composure. At that time, it would be the best time to kill him. You are very anxious, but what's the use of this? In the end, you still won't be able to hold on. Bai Lizi continued to mock him. Xiao Yang ignored him and continued to look for an opportunity. As long as there was a slight flaw, it would be enough. That person has appeared. The voice of the world spirit suddenly appeared in Xiao Yang's mind. In the middle of the mountain, a man in a black robe stood on the lush green land. He smiled faintly as he looked at the spiritual flowers and herbs that grew all over the ground. He had also discovered some clues. The vitality here was only on the surface. Although there were also spiritual veins underground, there were also spiritual veins. However, in the middle part there was a fault, and the soil had lost its spiritual energy. Interesting. It seems that something extraordinary happened in this place previously, the man in the black robe said and clicked his tongue in wonder. He really could not imagine what kind of work this was. At least the man in the black robe could be sure that this method could be guessed. This place must have lost its vitality long ago, but someone deliberately used spiritual flowers and herbs to nourish this land. Coincidentally, the spiritual veins also extended to this place, so it formed such a situation, causing the spiritual energy here to be a little intermittent. The man in the black robe muttered, and his eyes began to shine with a trace of sharpness. In his eyes there was more greed. Although this spiritual veins of the world are just new and not mature, it is indeed a pity to swallow it now. However, it can give me a helping hand and allow me to reach a higher level in terms of my cultivation. I might even get more. The more the man in the black robe said, the more excited he became. Chapter 2268. Xiao Yang couldn't help but frown when he heard Mr. White's whereabouts. This was because that guy had sneaked into the middle peak without anyone noticing. This gave him a huge headache. As for why that person would sneak into that place, it was also worth pondering. After all, it was impossible for the other party to do something meaningless. Every move of theirs had a purpose. Furthermore, they had caused such a huge commotion. From this, it could be deduced that their scheme was not that simple. The more he thought about it, the more nervous Xiao Yang felt. When Bai Lizi saw the change in Xiao Yang's expression, he laughed even more heartily. The lightning on his body gathered even faster. It seems like you've thought of something. Do you want me to be merciful and tell you? Bai Lizi was very happy to see his opponent's ugly face. It had to be said that from the start of this battle, the battle between the two of them had been unfair to begin with. However, Bailizi was also very satisfied with this. Being able to make his opponent worry and easily defeat him was naturally a wonderful thing. He would not refuse such an opportunity. If he could put in less effort, why would he want to put in more effort? Regarding this, Bailizi's thoughts could be said to be very pure. War was full of schemes, rules, and schemes. This was not a competition where one had to be cautious and overcautious. As long as one could obtain victory, it would not be a problem even if one had to resort to any means necessary. As long as he could win, what did it matter? Xiaoyang frowned and his lips curled up. Isn't it just that mister by who snuck into the flowing cloud world? Hearing this, Bailizi's expression changed. This was something that he did not expect. Could it be that this human cultivator was really good at divination? Now, Xiaoyang was also in a difficult position. He felt that Mr. Bai would most likely take drastic measures to attack the North Light City, Baixing City, or the Taiyang sect and the Taiyin sect, which were the foundations of the Taiyang sect and the Taiyang sect. However, Xiaoyang was puzzled by the fact that he had appeared in the barren middle peak. He felt that there was something wrong with this matter. Looks like your spies aren't bad. You can even find out about this. But I'm curious, what are you going to do now? If you stop me here, your home will be gone. Blood will flow like a river. If you return to help, then this last line of defense will also be broken by me. Bailizi quickly adjusted his state of mind and joked. Hearing this, Xiaoyang's eyebrows furrowed even more. He was naturally aware of the seriousness of this matter. Although he hadn't figured out Mr. White's intentions yet, he still needed to think about it carefully. It seems that no matter what you choose, it will be a path of defeat for you. The more Bailizi spoke, the happier he was. Everything was within his calculations, and just as he said, no matter what decision Xiaoyang made, he would be unable to continue because he could not take care of both ends. At the beginning of this plan, it could be said that everything had been decided. This was originally used to deal with Xiaoyang's strength. With the help of the formation, he might be able to withstand the attacks of 2 third-level martial royal realm experts. In this way, once the power was divided, he would not be able to take care of both ends. He would have to make a choice. However, no matter what choice he made, he would be torn apart, and it would be difficult for him to withstand. Then he would have to face the reality, which was the defeat of a place. In the end, it would be the defeat of the whole world. It would even be difficult for them to continue to defend, and they would be utterly defeated. If I kill you, it won't be too late to go there. Xiaoyang snorted and said. Under such a situation, Xiaoyang was indeed a little panicked. Right now, his mind was indeed restrained. Moreover, no matter what choice he made, there would indeed be problems. Thunder, lightning, fire, plunder. Xiaoyang bellowed as he slashed out with his sword. At this point, Xiaoyang could only give it his all. No matter what, as long as he could kill Bailizi first, everything would be much simpler. As long as he could not continue to fight, with Ji Fei and the others' abilities, it was not impossible for them to continue to defend by relying on the formation. Therefore, he had already thought about what was more important and what was more important. The strategy of keeping the enemy as a means of self-respect had to be changed because of the change in the opponent. Xiaoyang did not know what the consequences would be if he killed these people. However, if he did not kill them, he was afraid that destruction would be right in front of him. Xiaoyang was not an indecisive person. Now that he had to make a choice, he naturally could not hesitate. When Bailizi saw Xiaoyang suddenly charging at him, the smile on his face became wider. Now that Xiaoyang was acting like a cornered dog jumping over a wall and wanted nothing more than to kill him, it was clear that he was afraid. However, when experts fought, sometimes the more anxious they were, the easier it was for them to lose their minds. Because they were anxious, they would reveal more flaws. This was where Bailizi's opportunity lay. If he could kill it directly, then it would be a great merit. Bailizi did not get angry at all. He knew very well that as long as his opponent attacked several times, he would not be able to control his mind because of his anxiety. At that time, his opponent would panic. Moreover, the attacks from both sides complemented each other to begin with. Even if that side was defeated, it didn't matter. That was because the opening on the other side was enough to completely defeat the opponent. They needed an opportunity to take down the drifting cloud boundary. What they were doing now was to forcefully create such an opportunity. So what if the fire and lightning were dazzling? As long as Bailizi forcefully defended, then there would be no problem. He had seen Xiao Yang's strength before and knew how terrifying he was. Now, as long as he paid attention, then these problems would naturally not exist. Such pure thoughts also made Bailizi's mind very firm. His power surged out like an iron wall, protecting Yi Fuqian inside. Xiao Yang still did not retreat at all. Also because he was anxious. Under this sword, they had to determine the winner and loser. He could not be careless at all. At the same time, his other hand suddenly formed a seal. Chapter 2269. Bailizi was stunned when he saw the spell because he felt that this wasn't as simple as it seemed. Since the other party was so eager to kill him, then naturally he wouldn't do anything meaningless. What was the point of him forming that spell? When he thought of this, Bailizi felt a little uneasy in his heart. He could even feel a cold aura enveloping him. Because he knew his opponent too well, he felt that there was a conspiracy going on. Therefore, Bailizi was on full alert. From his point of view, as long as he was careful, there wouldn't be a problem. As long as he could defend against this attack, Xiao Yang would definitely reveal an opening. At that time, it would be time for him to win. As long as he could hold on, that would be enough. However, in the next moment, Bailizi was stunned because he felt that the energy in his body wasn't flowing smoothly. He even felt numb, as if the veins in his body had disappeared. No, they didn't disappear, they lost consciousness. At this critical moment, Bailizi had already sensed that things were not as simple as he thought. However, he couldn't pinpoint exactly what had gone wrong. Therefore, all he could do was grit his teeth and hold on. As for the other matters, he probably couldn't force them to do so much. That sword had already pierced through the layers of lightning. Xiao Yang didn't seem to feel anything as he allowed the lightning to strike his body. He charged forward bravely and attacked mercilessly as if he was ready to kill his opponent. Right now, Xiao Yang's thoughts were incomparably resolute. He also knew that this was his only chance. The key to victory had already been buried during the Battle of Spring Sun City. As for why he hadn't used it until now, it was just a coincidence. However, now that he had made his move, he had to kill. That was the only way to ensure that there wouldn't be so many accidents. It could even be said that he couldn't afford to make a single mistake. Bailizi couldn't control his body as he watched the sword coming towards his heart. He couldn't help but feel hopeless. He didn't know what had happened to him, but he could feel that if he didn't dodge, he would probably lose his life in this place. Under such circumstances, he continued to roar, but due to the numbness, even his voice became somewhat intermittent and desolate. After all, Bailizi was a third-order martial emperor. He used all of his strength, and a powerful thunderbolt exploded once again. If he wanted to live, his only choice was to stake it all on this one throw. Otherwise, he was afraid that he would end up in the same state as his comrades. He still had a bright future ahead of him. How could he give up his life here? Therefore, Bailizi was filled with unwillingness and unleashed his most powerful attack. That huge thunderbolt struck Xiao Yang's body. However, he did not retreat at all. His sword was still in the same position. When everyone saw this, they couldn't help but raise their eyebrows, especially the army of the White Bear tribe. Every one of them was shocked. They finally saw what it meant to be unparalleled in courage. Moreover, this was only a human cultivator. How terrifying was he to be able to do this? Ji Fei found it strange, but at the same time, he also felt that Xiao Yang must be afraid of something. That was why he was so anxious. When he connected all the dots, Ji Fei felt that this matter wasn't as simple as it seemed. As for what exactly was wrong, he couldn't put his finger on it for a moment. However, a sense of grief welled up in his heart. A lone tree couldn't hold up the sky. This was probably what they meant. No matter where he was, he had to face it. Sometimes he had to take risks. However, under such circumstances, Ji Fei was also helpless. This was because he was already struggling to deal with Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang's joint attack. How could he spare the energy to help Xiao Yang? Qi. The sword pierced Bai Lizi's heart with unerring accuracy. Immediately, the power of fire and lightning exploded. The two-sword qis rampaged in his body, trying to kill his life force. Get lost! Bai Lizi roared. He slapped out with his claw and sent Xiao Yang flying. Bai Lizi lowered his head to look at the hole in his chest. The pain in his body made him dizzy. Bai Lizi, who had fought for many years, never thought that he would fall for this today. If word got out, it would be a joke. However, this was real. There was nothing fake about it. The more he thought about it, the sadder Bai Lizi felt. How did things come to this? How did this happen? There were too many questions in his heart. He couldn't figure it out. Xiao Yang's body was charred, but he didn't fall. Instead, he stood up with his sword. Right now, he was in a paranoid state. He knew very well that only by killing Bai Lizi could he get rid of all these threats. Or else, he wouldn't be able to go to Zhongyu and fight against Mr. Bai. When Bai Lizi saw this, he immediately spat out a few mouthfuls of black blood in agitation. His strong desire to live was constantly telling him that if he continued to fight, death would be the only way out for him. Therefore, he didn't want to fall. He wanted to live. Looking at the ongoing battle, Bai Lizi was even more furious. Everything was originally planned out. So why would there be such a huge change in the blink of an eye? Bai Lizi couldn't figure it out. However, he felt the sword qis rise again. Bai Lizi didn't dare to think too much. He turned around and left. After all, the most important thing right now was to survive. Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang stared with their mouths agape. Their strongest fighter had been defeated and was running away. What were they going to do now? Xiao Yang couldn't even win against Bai Lizi. They were at the same level, so it would be even more difficult for them to fight against him. Xiao Yang glanced at them. Then his gaze landed on Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang. If he killed the two of them, then the danger here would be completely resolved. It was even possible that they would counterattack. That person's goal is probably the spirit vein. Chapter 2270. Hearing the news from the world spirit, Xiao Yang was shocked. Previously, he thought that Mr. Bai's method was to attack the root of the problem and destroy their foundation. However, who would have thought that Mr. Bai's method was even more ruthless? If the world's spirit vein was taken away, the foundation of the drifting cloud world would be broken and their rising confidence would be completely destroyed. Now, Xiao Yang could no longer make a choice. The world's spirit vein was the most important thing. Although it was not as powerful as the realm of the gods, it was their hope and it could not be destroyed. Can you stop him? Xiao Yang asked. The world spirit said, I can use the power of the world to stop him temporarily, but it might not be able to last for long. Hearing this, Xiao Yang had a rough idea of what was going on. He did not expect that Mr. Bai would use the middle peak as an entry point. This could be said to be out of his expectations. But no matter what, since the situation was already like this, he couldn't delay any longer. Come out. With a loud shout, a ball of flame suddenly appeared, and it was constantly cheering and jumping. Under the premise of guarding this place, you can eat whatever you want. Xiao Yang instructed. Xiao Hu jumped up and down joyfully, looking like he understood. Then he charged down and attacked Bai Yingfeng. Just guard this place. Don't chase after him. Xiao Yang had just finished speaking, and he disappeared from the spot. Guarding the world's spirit vein was the most important thing at the moment. He could not afford to be careless. It was also because of this that Xiao Yang couldn't afford to waste a single second. The middle peak was quite far away. Even though Xiao Yang had the power of the world, it was difficult for him to rush there in an instant. When Ji Fei saw Xiao Yang leave in a hurry, he knew that he must have met with a great change. That was why he left in such a hurry. What exactly happened that caused him to leave in such a hurry? He even seemed to be in a bit of a mess. Then, Ji Fei did not think too much about it. After all, he could not help Xiao Yang with what he wanted to do. Instead, the most important thing now was to defend against Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang's attacks. That was the most important thing. It was something that he could do. Bai Yingfeng retreated to the side, and his expression became more serious. Now that Bai Liguang had suddenly retreated, their plan was in a deadlock. Many people had lost their courage because of this. Even the strongest person had been defeated, so what could they do? Bai Liguang, should we continue to fight or retreat? Bai Yingfeng asked softly. When Bai Liguang heard this, he immediately retreated to the side. At the same time, he began to think. Although Xiao Yang had already left, the spiritual fire he left behind was extremely difficult to deal with. It was so much so that even with his own strength, it was difficult for him to fend them off. They were now in a dilemma. It seemed that no matter how they advanced or retreated, they would be asking for trouble. If we continue to fight, we have to at least hold on for a while. Otherwise, if they were to retreat in defeat, their morale would fall to rock bottom. At that time, if Mr. Bai wants to punish us, which one of us can bear the responsibility? Bai Liguang hesitated for a long time, then slowly said. Bai Yingfeng nodded slightly. Although the beginning of their retreat was because of Bai Liguang's failure, however, the war had already begun, and it was not appropriate for him to withdraw himself from the battle. It was not difficult for them to leave now. However, if they went back just like that, wouldn't it be too shameless? If that's the case, we'll deal with the spiritual fire together. The rest of you, try to break through the formation. Regardless of whether you succeed or not, hold on for a while longer. If there's no chance, we'll immediately retreat to the camp and wait for Mr. Bai's orders. Bai Yingfeng made a prompt decision. Everyone obeyed and began their activities. They did not dare to be careless or ambiguous about this matter. At the same time, they were very worried. If Xiao Yang returned, all of them might die here. However, even though they were dissatisfied, they could only suppress it. If they could get through this, it would be the most worrying thing. Ji Fei was facing an even more powerful attack, and he began to have some problems dealing with it. Fortunately, Xiao Hu was so powerful that they did not dare to act rashly. Otherwise, it would be difficult to say what the consequences would be. After a few exchanges, the pressure on each of them continued to multiply. In the middle peak, the black-robed man stood there. Suddenly, he saw thunderclouds gathering in the sky, and a disdainful smile appeared on his face. Their innate power was lightning. Wasn't it a little too wishful thinking to think that they could stop him with this? What's more, such a method was completely meaningless. All the world spirit could do was use all the force of nature to protect itself and delay this person's advance. Once Xiao Yang arrived, they could work together to kill him. In the next moment, a bolt of lightning streaked across the night sky and struck down. Its target was the black-robed man. However, the black-robed man still had a disdainful smile on his face. It was as if the attack was nothing to him, and he could destroy it with a wave of his hand. Afterwards, the black-robed man extended a hand and clenched it gently in the air. The bolt of lightning that descended from the sky was suddenly snapped, turning into countless sparks that rained down. It was an extremely dazzling sight. He allowed the sparks to land on his black robes. He did not even glance at them, as he only found it extremely funny. This miniature world is truly extraordinary to be able to give birth to a world spirit vein. It can even sense the threat I pose to it, so it has begun to protect itself. If this is the case, once I take it down, I might be able to break through to a higher realm. As the black-robed man spoke, his eyes were almost shining. The black-robed man was naturally Mr. Bai. The reason why he was called Mr. Bai was because he was well-read. He could be said to be the most knowledgeable person in the White Bear tribe. It could even be said that he was one of the most knowledgeable people in the entire Myriad Beast realm. Naturally, he had read about the world spirit veins in ancient books. However, he had never had the chance to eat it. However, this place was weak enough that he could do whatever he wanted. Chapter 2271. When he came to the flowing cloud boundary, Mr. Bai had already noticed that there was something different about this world. Unexpectedly, after careful investigation, he really found something wrong. According to the previous plan, once he settled down in West Wind City, he would rush to the Victory Mountain the next day to fight, and then crush all the way to take down this small world. In the end, because he noticed the existence of the world's spirit vein, after weighing the pros and cons, he found that he had the ability to swallow it. Therefore, he changed the strategy that he had already decided on. Although he killed his way in, he could still get this world's spirit vein. However, it was inevitable that some variables would occur, and Bailey Z was that variable. When the time came, if he sensed something, it would be difficult for him to take it all for himself. Therefore, the best choice was to leave it at Summit Victory Mountain and come alone. As for Xiao Yang, with Bai Lizi holding him back, wouldn't he be able to do whatever he wanted? Even on the way here, Mr. Bai had already learned the information about the flowing cloud boundary, so he had some understanding. He was also very satisfied with his plan. Even if Bai Lizi was really defeated and died in the battle at the Victory Mountain, so what? As long as he could swallow this world's spirit vein, his strength would inevitably skyrocket. At that time, there would be a huge gap in the realm. How could Xiao Yang be his opponent? It was already very difficult to challenge someone of a higher realm. If he wanted to fight someone of a higher realm, it would be a fantasy. The dark clouds in the sky gradually dispersed, revealing the full moon. The light once again sprinkled on the ground, and the spiritual flowers and grass looked particularly beautiful under the moonlight. But in the next moment, the ground began to tremble rapidly. All of a sudden, 2 huge mountains came crashing down. The black-robed man looked at the 2 big mountains coming over, still indifferent. It was as if all of this was not a problem for him. The world spirit was able to seal the traitor before, so he naturally had the ability. Unfortunately, because of the turmoil last time, his vitality was greatly damaged, so the power that he could use now was pitifully little. Otherwise, he would not need to rely on Xiao Yang to rescue him. He could seal him in a secret realm and make it difficult for him to escape. The power of the 2 mountains was also not to be underestimated. However, the black-robed man formed a seal. Soon after, he let out a low cry and pointed his hands at the 2 menacing mountains. Suddenly, the 2 mountains exploded in midair, turning into dust that drifted in the air. For a moment, the sky was filled with smoke and dust, almost covering the sky and the moon. Interesting. It seems this world has developed a bit of sentience, the black-robed man mumbled to himself. At the same time, he knew in his heart that it would not be an easy task to obtain the world's spirit vein. At the very least, this world's rejection of him was enough to give him a headache. How to solve this problem? Even the knowledgeable Mr. White could not solve it. After all, this world was not the world he was in. If he wasn't strong enough, he might have been suppressed. Now, it was just difficult for him to use this world's spiritual power. That was not a problem. What other tricks do you have? Just use them. Otherwise, it will be my turn to act, the black-robed man said with a cold laugh. However, no one responded to him. There was only silence and dust swirling in the air. At this moment, the black-robed man was not in a hurry to act, because he felt that the time was not yet right. No matter what it was, there were some things that he was particular about. Perhaps Mr. White felt that there was something missing, so he was not in a hurry. There was no harm in waiting a little longer. After waiting for a long time, he did not see any new movements. As such, he was certain that this world had no other tricks up its sleeve, so it could only wait for its death. From Mr. White's perspective, no matter how much this world struggled, no matter how many tricks it used, it would be useless. There was no point in it. The big picture had been set up by him long ago, and no one could change it. Then, Mr. White's hands began to form seals again. Since the time was right, he naturally had to proceed to the next step. The earlier he took down this person, the more trouble there would be. In the blink of an eye, with the black-robed man as the center, a hurricane was formed. A great aura swept out, and the surrounding spiritual herbs and spiritual flowers were turned into powder in an instant. The powder kept spinning in the wind. That aura was so vast that it seemed like it was going to suppress the entire middle peak. As the incantation continued, the smile on the black-robed man's face became even wider, because, from his perspective, he might be able to reach the sky in one step because of this. Everything could be said to be right in front of him, within reach. Suddenly, the black-robed man's smile froze, and even his eyebrows were tightly knitted together. His hand seals, which were originally changing endlessly, immediately stopped. The wild wind that was originally stirred up stopped at this moment, and the dust and petals that were stirred up fell one after another. I didn't expect it to come so quickly. It seems that he is not going to take the barrier of the Victory Mountain, the black-robed man scolded in a low voice, somewhat annoyed. In the next moment, the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile again. Because of this, he could see that this person was indeed worthy of being an opponent, because Xiaoyang was not muddle-headed at all. He understood the crux of the matter, and also knew what was more important. So what if the Victory Mountain was lost? In the end, it was just a line of defense that could be relied on. However, once the world's spiritual vein was gone, the world would really be finished. So what if it was here? Although he could not gain any benefits, their line of defense was destined to be destroyed. That hole would certainly be the beginning of their defeat. After a while, Xiaoyang landed in front of the black-robed man. Looking at the travel-worn Xiaoyang, the black-robed man smiled meaningfully. However, this smile made Xiaoyang frown involuntarily. This was because he recognized this face from Bailey Kwong and the other's divine senses. It could be said that in the White Bear tribe among the third-level martial emperors, only this person had the highest status. Moreover, there was no dispute that this person was in existence that the experts of the two tribes willingly accepted. This was Bai Wuxi, who was known as Mr. Bai. Chapter 2272. Bai Wuxi's smile also became more and more strange. His bright eyes seemed to be able to see through everything. In this dark night, although there was a change in the situation, everything seemed to be under his control. However, everything seemed to be under his control. He remained calm and arrogant as he stared at this cultivator from a different minor world. Now, Bai Wuxi admired this young man more and more. Previously, it was no small matter that he was able to defeat the Bailey branch's army. Then he gave up on West Wind City and Spring Sun City and directly retreated to Pine Victory Mountain. He gathered all his forces together. This kind of insight and courage was also extraordinary. Of course, what shocked Bai Wuxi even more was that they retreated so decisively without losing a single soldier. This was what was rare and commendable. As the commander, one order was related to the life and death of countless cultivators. If there was a trace of carelessness, it could lead to irreversible consequences. But in the blink of an eye, Bai Wuxi's expression returned to normal. Because, in his opinion, so what if Xiaoyang arrived? No matter how strong his combat strength was, could he be his opponent? Xiaoyang was the best in the same realm and could challenge those of a higher realm. Then, how could he, Bai Wuxi, not be? You're talking about Bailey Z, right? I don't think he has the ability to make a move now. Xiaoyang said with the corners of his mouth raised slightly. If it wasn't for the fact that Pine Victory Mountain was as stable as Mount Tai, how could he come here with peace of mind? After all, no matter which link went wrong, it would be a very heavy blow to the entire drifting cloud boundary. Therefore, all he could do was to solve all these uncertainties. In this way, he could be at ease and not have to worry anymore. Hearing this, Bai Wuxi's expression suddenly changed. Because Bailey Z didn't have the ability to make a move, there was a lot to ponder about. Logically speaking, with Bailey Z's ability, even if he couldn't take down Xiaoyang, The battle between them should have lasted for a long time. Could it be that they had reached some secret agreement? However, this idea was rejected in the blink of an eye. After all, no matter how stupid Baileyzy was, he would know what to do in this situation. If he were to affect the progress of the tribe because of a little unhappiness, then he would be a sinner for all eternity. Don't try to scare me with groundless words. Do you really think you can make me leave and give up everything? Baiwuxi laughed contemptuously, because Baiwuxi didn't know what was going on at Pine Victory Mountain. He could only use the information he knew to make inferences and calculations. But no matter how one looked at it, there seemed to be no reason for them to lose. In fact, in Baiwuxi's opinion, this was a battle that he had a 90% chance of winning. It was simply impossible for him to lose. As for whether or not there would be any accidents, that was out of his control. At the very least, from the information and arrangements he had received, unless that person from the god realm suddenly broke out of seclusion, none of this would exist. Whether he's bluffing or not, you'll know once you go and take a look, Xiaoyang said. As he said this, Xiaoyang's expression was still very calm, because in his opinion, this matter was nothing more than that. In Xiaoyang's opinion, if Baiwuxi couldn't get close to the world's spirit vein and he arrived in time, then everything would be over. At the very least, it would be difficult for Baiwuxi's plan to succeed. The smile on Bai Wu, she's face grew even wider. From his point of view, this young man was clearly trying to trick him since he had already said so much. If he didn't have any worries, why would he need to say so much? As the saying goes, there must be something wrong when things are out of the ordinary. And Xiaoyang's reaction and attitude, now, were originally problematic. Even though he looked very calm right now, that was just his external appearance. Perhaps, in his heart, he was already in a perilous situation and was extremely frightened. You're quite an interesting person. What's the point of playing these little tricks with me now? Baiwuxi said very confidently. Everything was under control. So how could there be any accidents? This was originally a battle where the strength was extremely unequal. If it wasn't for the fact that the person in front of him really had some tricks up his sleeves, and that there was something here that tempted him, how could Baiwuxi use such a method? It could be said that Baiwuxi only needed to suffer a little more in the battle at Taste Victory Mountain and fight together with Bailizi. Then, no matter how monstrous Xiaoyang was, how could he block their attacks? In the end, all these words were just deliberately mystifying. Did he want to use just a few words to make him give up the fat meat that was about to enter his mouth? How could this be possible? It seems that you're not going to leave this place. As Xiaoyang said, he waved the divine sword in his hand, and an extremely tyrannical aura burst out. Originally, Xiaoyang didn't want to start a battle here, but Baiwuxi's attitude seemed to be that he wouldn't give up until he achieved his goal. Since that was the case, the only way to prevent future troubles was to kill him. As for other things, they were not within his calculations. Moreover, since Baiwuxi knew the location of the spiritual vein of the world and had already coveted it, he naturally had to die. Otherwise, as long as he was alive, he would be a great threat to the foundation of the drifting cloud boundary. Although it was said that if they started a battle here, the middle peak that had just recovered some vitality with great difficulty would become a place of death again. However, there was nothing they could do. After all, they still knew what was more important, and what was more important. As long as the middle peak wasn't directly destroyed, there was still a possibility of recovery. If they miscalculated, the consequences would be really terrifying. No matter what step they took, they had to be extremely careful. Choosing the most acceptable price to pay was enough. Sometimes, if they thought too much, they would be restrained. What? Do you think you can make me stay here? Let's see if you have the ability to do so. Baiwuxi sneered. Baiwuxi really couldn't understand. This young man had always been making great progress. Was it because of this that he had lost his mind and thought that he was invincible? Xiaoyang just held the divine sword tightly and started to think about how to kill Baiwuxi, who was known as Mr. Bai. It wouldn't be easy to kill him. I am now a 4th level half-step martial emperor. What ability do you have to defeat me? You have no chance. Bai Wuxi's voice became colder. Chapter 2273. Bai Wuxi was still as confident as ever. In his opinion, everything was so simple. With his cultivation, wouldn't it be a piece of cake for him to defeat a second-order martial emperor? At the very least, he did not think it would take much effort. On the other hand, Xiao Yang's expression turned grave. He knew very well that Bai Wuxi was also an invincible existence in the White Bear tribe. Now that he had reached the half-step to 4th-level martial royal realm, how terrifying would his strength be? All of this went without saying. In this battle, he really didn't have much of an advantage. At the very least, the person in front of him was much stronger than Bailey Quang, Bailey Feng, and the others. Faced with such a huge problem, Xiao Yang felt a little depressed. Fortunately, he had a backup plan, so it was not impossible for him to win against this person. However, once he used some of his powers, he would definitely lose his life or even his soul. Otherwise, it would only bring more trouble to the drifting cloud realm. Although it was only a matter of time before they went to war with the Wanshou realm, Xiao Yang still hoped that the time could be delayed. At the very least, with more time, their strength would slowly grow and they would have some ability to resist. However, looking at the current situation, it seemed impossible. If they were to fight on Pine Victory Mountain, it might take a few years. However, Bai Wuxi's move had directly intensified the war, and it would not stop until one of them was dead. What's wrong? Now that you know my true strength, you're starting to tremble? Bai Wuxi said. The disdainful smile on his face became a little arrogant. A gust of cold wind blew past. Although the two of them were indifferent, they had never stopped scheming in their hearts. Although Bai Wuxi had a huge advantage in terms of cultivation base, the young man's previous battle results could not be ignored. Sometimes, it was often a moment of carelessness that would bury the root of disaster for oneself. Therefore, all accidents had to be eliminated. As for what Xiao Yang said about Bailey Zi not being able to fight, Bai Wuxi didn't think it was that important. After all, as long as he could destroy the pillar of this world and obtain the world's spirit vein, his strength would skyrocket and he would break through his shackles to reach an even higher realm. At that time, who would be able to stop him in this tiny, drifting cloud world? In fact, even if that Almighty who was in seclusion in the God realm came out of seclusion, he might not be a match for him. Therefore, in terms of mental state, Bai Wuxi still had a great advantage. As long as all of this was calculated clearly, then his heart would naturally be at ease, and there would be no panic. It could be said that he didn't underestimate his opponent at all. Every step of the way could be said to be equal to the other party, eliminating all risks. The reason why Bai Wuxi was able to stand out among those of the same level in his tribe was because of his incomparably calm temperament. That was why he was able to win every battle. Even now, he was the leader of this invasion. I was just thinking that you're quite smart, so why would you have such thoughts? In the end, you even risked your own life. Xiao Yang said with a smile. At the same time, the divine sword in his hand was like a divine sword. Instantly, the aura of lightning and fire turned into sword aura and surged out. Between them, one wanted to obtain, while the other wanted to hold on. Therefore, this battle was unavoidable. They would not stop until one of them was dead. Bai Wuxi felt that this was simply a joke. Why was his opponent still so confident that he would definitely win? Or could it be that he had some kind of strong backup plan? Even if that was the case, so what? A middle-grade spiritual weapon's power is indeed extraordinary. If that's all there is to it, it might be difficult to shake my position. Bai Wuxi sneered. Of course, this was also what Bai Wuxi had analyzed from what he knew. That middle-grade spiritual weapon was Xiao Yang's trump card. In Bai Wuxi's opinion, Xiao Yang was just pretending to be calm. He wanted to use such an attitude to scare him off. Such an idea was laughable. Maybe if someone else came, they would be suspicious and might even retreat without a fight. But who was he? He was Bai Wuxi. He had thought through all the suspicious points, and even planned for the worst-case scenario. He had thought about it countless times. Therefore, he really couldn't find any reason to lose. Xiaoyang smiled, and the sword aura around him rose. Countless sword auras emitted 2 different kinds of aura. They were extraordinarily sharp, like thousands of soldiers and horses ready to attack. Piak! Bai Wuxi casually waved his hand, and a whip flew out. The whip hit the ground and created a ravine. The whip was also covered with lightning. Lightning flowed around it in a continuous cycle. You have a middle-grade spiritual weapon. Do you think I don't have one? This thunderbolt whip is just as good as the sword in your hand. Bai Wuxi said calmly. Though the White Bear tribe was strong in their physique, most people thought that spiritual weapons were of little value. They would even limit their abilities. Therefore, most people didn't use them. But Bai Wuxi was different. He could control these spiritual weapons well. Therefore, all the good stuff was in his hands. Bai Wuxi had calculated every single point. Therefore, he couldn't figure out how he lost. Could it be that it was all because of a simple home advantage? That advantage didn't add much to it. This was also why Bai Wuxi was so terrifying. Every point was a trap, and he always had the advantage. His opponent couldn't find any flaws, and he didn't even have the slightest chance to make a comeback. Looking at the thunderbolt whip, Xiaoyang's smile became more and more helpless. He really didn't expect such a situation to happen. This made him feel even more pressure. Against someone who was so calculative, it wasn't easy to deal with. It could even be said that this person had almost no flaws. As such, defeating and killing him was an impossible task, no matter how one looked at it. But Xiaoyang didn't hesitate. He still slashed with his sword. So what if it looked like he had no chance of winning? He had to fight. Chapter 2274. The result would only be known after the battle. No matter how meticulous one's calculations were, in the middle of a battle, mistakes are inevitable. Therefore, as long as one is human, one will make mistakes. Living beings are not puppets. They all have emotions and will. How can they be sure of every step and not make any mistakes? Therefore, no matter what, they would have to fight first. If he was lucky, he might be able to find some opportunities. If they continue to be in a stalemate and wait until their mentality is exhausted, they will lose everything. Therefore, temperament is also very important. In a battle of life and death, one's capability is not the only factor. Being brave and ruthless and having some experience were all related to each other. Seeing Xiaoyang rush over without thinking, Bai Wuxi's heart blossomed with joy. He was merely a brute. How was it possible for him to break through his defense? Of course, Bai Wuxi knew very well that it was because of this temperament and determination that Ling Xian was able to challenge those of a higher level. No matter what field one is in, once one reaches the extreme, one cannot be ignored. It is extremely terrifying. Therefore, even though Bai Wuxi was strong, he didn't dare to be careless. The whip in his hand began to swing. The thunderbolt whip danced around like a water snake, agile and ever-changing. However, the attack was also extremely aggressive. Against such a powerful attack, Xiaoyang's sword continued to dash forward. It was as if he wasn't afraid of the thunderbolt whip at all. He pressed forward without fear. At this moment, his desire to fight was at its peak. When two enemies meet on a narrow path, the courageous wins. If you have the slightest bit of fear, or even the slightest hesitation, you will bury the root of your defeat. Both of them had very strong and stable temperaments. Therefore, the attacks they launched were all carefully calculated. There was almost no problem with them. However, at the next second, Bai Wuxi's expression changed, because he felt like this guy was a brute. But who was the one who gave the order to retreat? Could it be that there was someone in this small world who was good at scheming, and the one in front of him was just a hired thug? There wasn't much time for Bai Wuxi to think. After all, the arrow had already been shot. How could he turn back? Bai Wuxi didn't panic in the slightest. The thunder-rushing whip in his hand whistled, looking extremely powerful. Since you want to throw away your life, I'll fulfill your wish. Why think so much? After all, you asked for it. Do you want to use this kind of attitude to make me lose my mind? Such a way of thinking was a big mistake. Bai Wuxi could be said to be quick-witted. He was able to figure out many key points in an instant. Therefore, he was able to make the right choice in the shortest amount of time. No matter where he was, he had that kind of talent. Therefore, he would not reveal his true form when facing someone like Xiaoyang. In fact, in Bai Wuxi's opinion, although his true form was strong, it was too clumsy and unagile. That was why he maintained his human form to fight. Although a human's mentality was weak, it won in terms of agility. The intersection of pros and cons had always been like this. Xiaoyang's sword arrived in the blink of an eye. Suddenly he disappeared. When he reappeared, he had changed his position. 7 steps of the barbarian god. The smile on Bai Wuxi's face became even wider. He muttered, "Interesting. So what if you suddenly change your position?" It wasn't as if he, Bai Wuxi, didn't know how to use the whip. It was just the time for him to turn around and shake his hand. He could adjust his position in an instant without any effort. Xiaoyang's eyebrows furrowed slightly when he sensed the powerful thunderbolt attack coming towards him. Sure enough, it was as he had expected. Bai Wuxi was not someone who could be taken down so easily. Moreover, his defense was perfect. Xiaoyang had almost no chance to break through it. As such, it seemed that no matter how one looked at it, there was still no chance of defeating it. Immediately, Xiaoyang changed his position again. Bai Wuxi only laughed disdainfully. With a flick of his wrist, he waved the whip again and attacked in another direction. Slap! When Xiaoyang reappeared, his waist was directly hit by the whip. He immediately grabbed it with one hand and stood still. Xiaoyang was shocked. He didn't expect Bai Wuxi to be able to see through his first use of the 7 steps of the barbarian god in front of this person. Moreover, he was able to predict the attack. It was obvious how terrifying this person was. If Xiaoyang's body wasn't tough enough and he had the support of Bai Wuxi's will, he would have been beaten down by this whip. It was even possible that he would have been cut in half. However, Xiaoyang still didn't have it easy. The power of lightning on the whip continued to bombard his body. Can you block it like this? Bai Wuxi laughed disdainfully. As he spoke, Bai Wuxi's wrist shook again. His eyes were full of determination. It was as if everything was still within his calculations. It wasn't surprising at all. Immediately, a surge of lightning energy swept out like a tidal wave. At this moment, Xiaoyang had no choice but to let go immediately. At the same time, he quickly retreated. Boom! The lightning at the end of the whip exploded. Immediately, an extremely bright light bloomed. As for Xiaoyang, he had already retreated 10 miles away. At the place where the lightning exploded, there was a large pit the size of a pond. It was obvious how terrifying the power of the lightning explosion was. If Xiaoyang's movements were a little slower, his entire arm might have exploded. Looking at the scorched pit full of debris and violent lightning elements, the corner of his mouth couldn't help but twitch. He didn't expect this guy's strength to be so terrifying. It was no wonder that Bai Wuxi was known as the strongest existence in the White Bear tribe. Not to mention his temperament. Just his strength alone was enough to make people fear him. Xiaoyang's hand that was holding the whip started to bleed. There were even burn marks on his hand, intertwining with each other. It seems like your strength is only SOSO. I really don't understand how trash like Bailey Zhen could be defeated by you. Bai Wuxi's tone was full of contempt. Chapter 2275. The battle at Pin Victory Mountain could be said to be in full swing. Ever since Xiaoyang left, Ji Fei had been guarding this place alone. In the beginning, his response was even more appropriate, and there were no mistakes. In terms of defense, there were no loopholes. Even Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang were in despair. Of course, that was caused by Bai Lizi's defeat. It was also because of Bai Yingfeng's decision that they wanted to give it a try. However, They realized that there was only one martial emperor guarding the front of Pine, Victory Mountain. As for their strongest cultivator, no one knew where he went, and there was no trace of him. In this way, they no longer had anyone to fear. When the two of them joined forces, they realized that they could suppress the other party. There was even a small group of warriors who charged in and began close combat with the other party's warriors at the foot of the mountain. As the situation changed, they realized that as long as that person wasn't there, they still had a chance. At least they wouldn't be defeated. Brother Guang, it seems that we still have a chance to take down Pine Victory Mountain. Bai Yingfeng suddenly smiled and said, it could be said that they had always regarded Pine Victory Mountain as the last barrier of the drifting cloud boundary. If they could break through it, then their army would naturally be able to march straight in. At that time, the other party would only have one strong cultivator. It would be difficult for them to provide reinforcements. At that time, it would only be a matter of time before they completely took down the drifting cloud boundary. It could be said that both sides knew the importance of this defensive line. It was also because of this that Ji Fei fought with his life and didn't hold back at all. They couldn't lose the defensive line of Pine Victory Mountain no matter what. Once it was lost, the consequences would be unimaginable. At least, he wouldn't allow this to happen before his eyes. Brother Bai, whether we can achieve promotion or not will depend on tonight, Bai Liguang said with a smile. Now, they had a tacit understanding, and the situation was starting to become clearer. Under such circumstances, what reason did they have to withdraw their troops? The dawn of victory seemed to be right in front of them. The two of them looked at each other. The previous grudges seemed to have been completely written off at this moment. At the very least, at this very moment, they were of one mind. They were prepared to take down this strategic location and open the door to invade the flowing cloud world. With their morale greatly boosted, the warriors of the White Bear tribe became even more ferocious and valiant. In just a short while, half of the soldiers stationed at the foot of the mountain were lost. Of course, there were also many White Bear warriors who had fallen, or had always been like this. Unless there was a great disparity in strength, it was absolutely impossible for a one-sided situation to occur. In war, there would naturally be bloodshed, and the heads of countless good men would fall to the ground. As the 6 martial emperors worked together to attack, after a few rounds, Ji Fei began to feel a little powerless. It was true that this array formation was strong enough. However, in the face of such a ferocious attack, it was still lacking. This was all because the difference in strength was too great, which was why such a situation had occurred. 2 second-order martial kings and 4 first-order martial kings were enough to crush Ji Fei if they joined forces. If it weren't for the help of this array, he would have been defeated a long time ago. He would have been utterly defeated, or even died in this battle. Even though Xiaoyang had taken care of by Li Zi, the biggest problem, the remaining people were still difficult for Ji Fei to defeat. This was why he was having such a hard time. One has to admit that under the circumstances where the enemy's general wasn't present, they were still able to do this. It was obvious how powerful they were. Ji Fei was on the verge of despair. This was because he didn't know how long this array could last under his control. It might not even last for a while. That was a possibility. However, he would do his best to hold on until the moment before he dies. Then this place would not fall. On the other side, an Almighty was running for his life. Seeing that Xiaoyang had left, Bai Lizi quickly returned to the battlefield. He was prepared to endure the pain and end this battle. However, who would have thought that the spiritual fire would continue to chase after him? In Xiaohua's eyes, the severely injured Bai Lizi was just a great tonic, so he wanted to devour him. This was why Xiaohua had left the battlefield. Otherwise, how could Taste Victory Mountain have fallen into such a dangerous situation? At this moment, Bai Lizi was complaining incessantly in his heart. He didn't expect Xiaoyang to have a backup plan. The spiritual fire's power was beyond his imagination. If this was before, Bai Lizi wouldn't be afraid of Xiaohua. However, he had been hit by Xiaoyang's Dao. Now he was extremely weak. Even the slightest use of his power would worsen his injuries. How could he resist? Therefore, all he could do now was to run for his life, hoping to escape the spiritual fire's pursuit. However, Xiao Hu was like a gluttonous child in front of delicious food. He wouldn't let go of Bai Li Zi and would continue to chase after him. If Xiao Hu couldn't devour him, he wouldn't leave. As for the task that Xiao Yang had given him, it was as if he had completely forgotten about it. This place is really strange. What bad luck! Bai Li Zi cursed in his heart. Now that he was angry, the poison in his body became even more difficult to suppress. At the same time, the pain made his face almost contorted, and his body was on the verge of collapsing. On the other hand, Xiaohua, who was following closely behind, was even more delighted, and the momentum of his charge became even faster. The delicious food was right in front of him. How could he miss such a great opportunity? As the poison took effect, Bai Li Zi found it even harder to control his emotions. It could be said that he was so anxious that the poison instantly exploded. Unable to control himself, he fell down. Xiao Hu seized the opportunity and rushed over. He swallowed Bai Li Zi in one gulp and seemed very satisfied. On the other side of the battlefield, Xiao Yang stood with his sword in hand. His face had become extremely grim. In a short period of time, he had attacked several times. However, every attack was blocked by the thunderbolt whip. Even his body had a few more scars because of this. Although his robe was a Dharma artifact, it was still damaged by the thunderbolt whip's attack. Bai Wuxi had taken care of everything. No matter where he was, he didn't leave any loopholes. It was as if it was impossible for them to break through his defenses. His calm expression was as calm as ever. Chapter 2276. Bai Wuxi had always been confident about this battle. Moreover, after dealing with the attacks just now, he was even more certain of his plan. So what if Xiao Yang's attacks were fierce? As long as his defense was watertight and he didn't give his opponent any chance, how could he kill him? When his heart completely collapsed and his strength was almost exhausted, wouldn't it be easy to kill him? In Bai Wuxi's eyes, all of this had also become extremely clear and very clear. Taking action after planning still had a huge advantage. Moreover, being able to take down his opponent with the least loss was a very good deal, no matter how one looked at it. At this moment, Xiao Yang's heart gradually began to change. "Do you need my help?" The voice of the world spirit also sounded in Xiao Yang's heart. If the world spirit cooperated with Xiao Yang, then it would be able to suppress Bai Wuxi for the first time. Moreover, Xiao Yang could also use the power of the world without restraint. As a result, Bai Wu, she would naturally not be a match for him. Xiao Yang shook his head. In his opinion, Bai Wuxi wasn't worth such a big fuss. At least, with his current ability, it wasn't impossible to defeat Bai Wuxi. Although there was almost no chance now, he still wanted to give it a try. After the world spirit received a reply, it didn't continue speaking. After all, Xiao Yang was still in charge of this matter. It was also happy to see Xiao Yang show more strength. Only when the world spirit was strong enough could it protect the safety of the world spirit. "Why is your face so ugly now? Where did your self-confidence go? Are you human cultivators, so weak that you can't even withstand a single blow?" Bai Wuxi mocked. Bai Wuxi wasn't just extremely talented in analysis, he was also very good at psychological analysis. If he could infuriate Xiao Yang now, his attacks would become even more ferocious. Similarly, he would reveal more flaws, and it would be easier to catch and defeat him. Bai Wuxi's heart was like a huge abacus that had been spinning long ago. No matter how the situation changed, he would be able to make the best decision in the shortest time possible. Xiao Yang's lips curled up slightly. He didn't expect to meet his match today. It seemed that if he didn't show some of his true abilities in this battle, it would really be difficult to win. Then, Xiao Yang swung the divine sword again, and his aura rose rapidly. Around Xiao Yang's body, there was a faintly discernible tornado that was constantly twisting. That was because his aura was so strong that the space around him couldn't bear it. Huh, so that's not all. However, in my eyes, your actions are nothing more than incompetent rage. Bai Wuxi's attitude was still very disdainful. Xiao Yang did not take the malice in their words to heart. There wasn't much meaning in a battle of words now, because both of them had entered their own states, and their hearts were extremely firm. How could their states of mind change and fall into someone else's rhythm just because of a few words? So that's all you're good at. You're just good at arguing, Xiaoyang said with a contemptuous smile. Bai Wuxi was slightly taken aback when he heard this, and then he smiled pleasantly. He didn't expect this guy to be able to maintain a calm state of mind. It wasn't easy. At the same time, Bai Wuxi also had his own analysis from this information. Although Xiao Yang's fighting style was like a boorish man, he was bold and careful. Although he didn't seem to have any rules, his heart was as clear as a mirror and wouldn't be affected. He could even counterattack. This made Bai Wuxi feel that they were the same kind of people, but the way they acted was different. At least in their hearts, they were very calm and steady. Bai Wuxi tightened his grip on the Thunderbolt whip. This kind of opponent was indeed difficult to deal with. He even needed to be more careful in the future. He knew very well that once his opponent grasped any opportunity, he would launch an attack like a mad dog. At that time, there would be no telling what kind of accident would happen. Bai Wuxi had seen this kind of character before. These people would stay put if they didn't move, but once they moved, they would drag their opponent down with them, even if they had to die. On the other hand, Bai Wuxi hated facing such opponents because they created too many uncertainties in the battle. I've never lost in a battle of words, but in terms of fighting, I've never lost to anyone in the same realm, not to mention you're one realm lower than me, Bai Wuxi said frankly. This was something that Bai Wuxi had always been proud of. In an environment like the Wanshou realm, it wasn't easy to be undefeated in the same realm. But one had to know that there were countless fierce beasts in the Wanshou realm, and it could be said that they reinforced and countered each other. Bai Wuxi had never lost, even when he met an opponent who was his natural enemy. The corner of Xiao Yang's mouth lifted slightly. Then your record might be broken tonight. After he finished speaking, the aura on Xiao Yang's body skyrocketed. The thunder and fire auras turned into sword chi in the blink of an eye and spread out around him. The sword auras grew more and more, as if they were a sword barrier. It was only a matter of a moment, but there was such an explosion. Bai Wuxi couldn't help but be startled. This guy really knew how to hide his strength. The explosion now couldn't be ignored. Therefore, Bai Wuxi didn't dare to hesitate at all. He waved the Thunderbolt whip in his hand again. Bolts of lightning surged, and the sound shook the sky. Suddenly, Xiao Yang swung his sword horizontally and rushed forward, slashing his sword towards Chu Yang. Instantly, the sword auras formed by countless flames and lightning circled around him, boosting his aura. Of course, the sword auras weren't as simple as boosting his aura. The power contained in each of the sword auras couldn't be underestimated. If a cultivator below the martial emperor realm was hit by the sword auras, even if they didn't die, they would be severely injured. Aggressive. 10,000 swords shot out at the same time. Xiao Yang's state of mind was very calm, so his hands were also very steady. This time, the attack was even steadier. There wasn't the slightest bit of weakness. It was as if there was nothing it couldn't destroy. Thundering fire sweep. Chapter 2277. The sword chi of the flame and the lightning collided. It was unstoppable. Bai Wuxi frowned slightly when he felt the power of the aura. At the same time, the lightning whip in his hand swung even faster. Instantly, his expression became fierce. Interesting, as expected of someone who can challenge those above his level. The power of this move is truly breathtaking. Bai Wuxi's expression turned serious as he spoke. No wonder Xiao Yang could kill, rank 3 powerhouses one after another. It turned out that his attacks had that kind of possibility. Moreover, this ruthlessness was no different from risking his life. Therefore, such an opponent was indeed very scary. However, Baiwuxi didn't panic in the slightest because he believed that everything was still within his control. No matter how strong one was, it was all within his calculations. How could one cause any trouble? Even if there was, it was within his expectations and could be dealt with. Wild lightning rolling, Baiwuxi shouted. As the weapon in his hand swung faster and faster, the aura that filled the air became even more powerful. It was as if it was unstoppable. Countless thunderbolts surged out like an army of thousands of men and horses. They charged forward as if they wanted to tear their opponent into pieces. Wherever the thunderbolt passed, the land would be filled with devastation. Countless potholes and gullies continued to appear after the thunderbolt passed. How could the power of a martial emperor be underestimated? After the flowing cloud realm leveled up, the strength of the entire realm had increased by dozens of times. Moreover, with the growth of the world spirit, it had become even stronger. However, when faced with the unintentional destruction of a martial emperor, it was still somewhat unbearable. The murderous aura became even more powerful. Even the living creatures in the surroundings prostrated themselves on the ground. Even those who were closer to it were directly annihilated. The battle between the two powerful auras could be said to be on the verge of breaking out. Neither would give way to the other. It could be said that neither was willing to give way to the other. Xiao Yang's expression was still very serious. This was because he knew very well what this slash meant. Although this sword strike couldn't determine the outcome of the battle, it could still probe a lot of things. However, there were risks as well. If he underestimated his opponent, then his probing this time could be said to be seeking his own death. The sword aura and the lightning collided together. Instantly, a rumbling sound could be said to rise and fall. The crackling sound of the explosion was incomparably loud, causing one's heart to tremble. However, the young man didn't back off even in the face of such a ferocious attack. It was as if none of this was enough to make him feel fear. Thus, he was fearless and continued to charge forward. Although the opponent's strength was terrifying, he couldn't back down even an inch. This was because in a battle, one's mental strength was second only to one's strength. If one lost one's mental strength, it was likely that one would not be able to fully unleash one's strength. Moreover, if a person felt that it was impossible to win, how could he win? In their hearts, they all felt that the outcome was already decided. Naturally, there was no possibility of a comeback. As for Xiaoyang, he naturally did not have such thoughts. Therefore, he relied on the advantage of his physical body and pressed forward courageously. He allowed the lightning that wasn't blocked by the sword aura to bombard his body. He didn't even make a sound as he continued to charge forward. It was as if as long as his sword pierced his opponent's body, his opponent would fall. It could be said that his thoughts were very pure. The victory of this battle would definitely belong to him. His mental strength was also incomparably firm. As for the gains and losses caused now, why should he care about them? As long as he could obtain victory at the critical juncture of life and death, then everything would no longer be a problem. This was what Xiaoyang wanted. Everything he was doing now was just to test the waters and expose his opponent's weakness. Although it was very risky, he had no choice but to do so when facing an opponent like Baiwuxi. Seeing the young man's fearless expression as if he was a puppet that didn't know pain and didn't care about gains and losses, the corner of his mouth couldn't help but twitch when he saw that. This was the first time he had seen such a human cultivator who didn't care about his life. What was this kind of person thinking? Of course, for cultivators who didn't have a strong sense of the world and were still invading other worlds, they couldn't understand this feeling. Therefore, it was hard to understand why the current Xiaoyang would risk his life like this. Since you want to risk your life, then I'll make sure you lose your life. Let's see how arrogant you can be then. Baiwuxi snorted coldly, and his face instantly turned extremely cold. In the next moment, the thunder whip in Baiwuxi's hand also swung faster and faster. The bolts of lightning became even stronger, as if they were the brilliance of the heavens that couldn't be offended. Xiao Yang gritted his teeth as he continued to charge forward. His hand was still extremely stable, as though nothing could shake him even the slightest bit. His mind could be said to be as resolute as iron. Bolts of lightning continued to bombard him, but he didn't even look at them. Relying on his willpower, he charged forward bravely. As Xiao Yang got closer and closer, Bai Wuxi couldn't help but frown even more. He felt that he had underestimated this opponent. His strength was indeed somewhat terrifying. Go to hell! Bai Wuxi shouted angrily and waved the Dharma artifact in his hand again. Suddenly, the sound of the Dharma artifact being waved was like a dragon's roar. In the next moment, an extremely huge thunder dragon spiraled out and charged directly at Xiao Yang. Wherever the thunder dragon passed, even the heavens and earth trembled. Since there was a change, he had to make up for the places that he hadn't anticipated. This was Bai Wuxi's method. No matter how valiant one was, in the end, it was just the courage of a reckless man. There was no meaning to it. Although the two sword chis were tyrannical, under the thunder dragon's sweep, they were quickly worn out. Looking at the thunder dragon, Xiao Yang couldn't help but become more nervous. Although the change in front of him was within his expectations, he was still a little surprised and astonished. Break! Xiao Yang roared and immediately stabbed the divine sword in his hand into the thunder dragon's head. Suddenly, the thunder dragon seemed to be nailed. It seemed to be continuing to charge forward, but it didn't move at all. It was as if it couldn't move forward at all. Meanwhile, the young man stood there like Mount Tai, unshakable. The sword chis were thunderous and the attacks were unceasing. The two of them faced off. Chapter 2278. Bai Wuxi couldn't help but frown as he looked at the Lei Long, who couldn't move an inch forward. That was because this was something he didn't expect. He felt that his opponent's spirit had been worn out when he was dealing with the wild thunderstorm. Moreover, he was in a state where he couldn't continue. Bai Wuxi only needed to put in a little more effort to defeat him. However, the final result was beyond his expectations. Bai Wuxi couldn't remain calm because he didn't expect such a possibility at all. He was a half-step rank 4 existence, while his opponent was only rank 2. The disparity in strength could be said to be incomparably great. Since that was the case, how did he do it? So, what exactly was going on? Bai Wuxi's mind was in a mess because this was beyond common sense. The reason for that was because he felt that it was impossible. However, it had truly happened right beside him, causing him to feel extremely depressed and unable to accept it. Suddenly, the corner of Xiao Yang's mouth curled up into a smile. That was because he had comprehended something now. As for the methods that he had never used before, could he give them a try? Although it was risky, he still had to do it. After all, it was necessary to make a start sometimes. Even though he was in a dangerous situation, he might lose his life if he got excited. Keep! Xiao Yang shouted, and the Thunderfire Divine sword in his hand began to tremble. Even the Lei Long that was pinned down started to sway uncontrollably. Seeing this scene, Bai Wuxi couldn't help but furrow his brows even more. That was because he couldn't understand what was going on. What was the reason for all of this? What kind of technique was this? Or was the sword different from the rest? Bai Wuxi didn't think that his Thunderbolt Whip would be any weaker than Xiao Yang's sword. At least, that was what Bai Wuxi was thinking. That was an impossible thing. But now he was calm and composed, and his opponent was unharmed under his meticulous attack? What the hell was going on? Bai Wuxi couldn't understand, so he was also very puzzled. However, he could only continue to control the lightning dragon, hoping that it would continue to charge forward. The power of the lightning dragon was still increasing, and it was becoming more and more ferocious. It was as if he was already unstoppable. As the thunder dragon roared, its voice became louder and louder. However, in the end, it was useless. No matter how much it roared, it was useless. That was because the moment the sword was stabbed into the ground, it seemed to have decided everything. The surrounding thunderbolts were still entangled with the sword chi. As they were constantly worn down, the power of the thunderbolts became weaker and weaker. Xiao Yang's expression was solemn. He pinched a sword finger and pointed it at the tip of the sword. In an instant, the lightning was so bright that it almost lit up the entire central peak. In the next moment, Bai Wuxi saw an even more shocking scene. It was as if the lightning dragon was no longer under his control, and it was still rapidly pouring into the divine sword. This scene caused Bai Wuxi's expression to become even more unsightly. This was because he had not expected such a thing to happen. What was going on here? Bai Wuxi couldn't figure it out, and his heart was in a mess. How could there be such a logic in this world? However, as the lightning dragon poured into the divine sword faster and faster, Bai Wuxi had no choice but to believe that what he was seeing was real. How is this possible? Bai Wuxi roared. As the saying goes, seeing is believing. However, even if Bai Wuxi saw it clearly, he still couldn't accept such an outcome. What was this all about? His attack was absorbed by his opponent just like that? And what was so strange about that sword? As the divine sword's radiance grew stronger and stronger, Bai Wuxi was also incomparably sure that he wasn't seeing things. It was real, although it was extremely illogical. The smile on Xiao Yang's face became even wider. This was because, in the Thunderfire sword technique, it was mentioned that one could borrow and withdraw force. Back then, the world spirit was able to raise the grade of the Thunderfire divine sword so quickly because it used its own natural power. Now, what Xiao Yang was doing was absorbing all this power into the divine sword, using it to refine the divine sword and strengthen its power. This move was indeed useful, but there were also problems. If he didn't control it well, the sword might shatter and be destroyed directly. If he didn't do it well, he would still suffer from the backlash and continue to be bombarded by the opponent's attacks. Xiao Yang's control was naturally unquestionable. Although it was extremely taxing on his mind, he was able to deal with it calmly without the slightest bit of nervousness. Everything seemed to be logical, and there was no need to think so much at all. The original pressure was completely reversed at this moment, and it was on Bai Wuxi's side. Until now, Bai Wuxi was still somewhat unable to accept it. He even held the thunderbolt whipped tightly, wanting to continue competing with Xiao Yang. Good. I'd like to see how much you can absorb. Bai Wuxi roared. Suddenly, his expression became ferocious. Since you can absorb power, let's see how much you can absorb and how much you can absorb. If you are insatiable, you might as well stuff yourself to death. Bai Wuxi also knew that some celestial artifacts did indeed have unparalleled magical effects. However, there was also a limit. Once the limit was exceeded, the celestial artifact would inevitably collapse. When that time came, how could the owner be protected under the collapse of the celestial artifact? If it was only a low-level celestial artifact that collapsed, it would naturally be nothing. However, the collapse of a spiritual-level celestial artifact was no small matter. Perhaps the entire middle peak would be destroyed in a single day. Now, Bai Wuxi was no longer as calm as before. Because of these changes, waves had appeared in his heart. The most important reason was that he couldn't understand what had caused all of this. Everything had happened too quickly, and it didn't conform to common sense. Now, Bai Wuxi also understood that he still knew too little about Xiao Yang. Otherwise, if he knew himself and his enemy, he would be able to calculate the best way to fight, or even make the final decision and completely defeat him. However, it was unnecessary to think about this now, because the battle had reached a white-hot state. Chapter 2279. Bai Wuxi did not expect this. He originally thought that he had everything planned out and nothing would go wrong. Everything was under his control. However, due to the lack of information, there were some changes. Moreover, such a change had also caused his calmness to change as well. It made him want to kill his opponent quickly. As for the price he had to pay, it was no longer important. In fact, he even started to fight, comparing the strength of both sides to see who was stronger. This seemed to be a little reckless. However, Bai Wuxi was a half step forth, rank martial king. How could the spiritual energy in his body be less than that of a second rank martial king? However, Baiwuxi did not know that the reason why Xiaoyang was so strong was because he entered the martial king realm with 9 small spiritual veins. Within the same realm, they were almost invincible existences, and challenging those of a higher realm could be said to be a common occurrence. Xiaoyang was a complete freak. Of course, he had taken a huge risk because of this. That was why he was able to do what he did. Otherwise, how could he be so strong today? When he wanted to push the flowing cloud realm into the middle realm, he had already started to plan. For the sake of the future, he had even pushed himself to the limit. After putting in so much effort and taking such a great risk, he had succeeded. In that case, if he was still not strong enough, then wouldn't everything he had done before be a joke? Therefore, even if it was a competition of spiritual energy, Xiaoyang was not afraid at all. Even if it was inevitable that he would be at a disadvantage. So what? He still had ways to be flexible and avoid some unnecessary possibilities. As more and more energy was absorbed, the godly sword began to tremble. During this period of time, it had absorbed too much energy. It was difficult to digest it all in a short period of time. When he saw this, Baiwuxi laughed out loud. This was not much different from what he had thought. Everything had a limit. Since his opponent had reached his limit, he might as well give him more energy to break through that limit. That godly sword was indeed interesting. However, being able to kill his opponent was the most important thing. Therefore, it was just a magic tool. It didn't matter if it was destroyed. If you have the ability, then absorb all of my power. Baiwuxi roared. Suddenly, his expression became rampant. No matter what it was, it had its flaws. Therefore, Baiwuxi felt that if he grasped this point, he could use it to defeat his opponent. Then you can continue to try. The corners of Xiaoyang's mouth curled up slightly, and his expression was filled with disdain. This was a blatant mockery. Baiwuxi almost lost control of his mind. But he was Baiwuxi, so he was able to maintain his rationality. You're just bluffing. Baiwuxi said angrily. In his past battles, he had seen too many of them. Human cultivators had always liked to play tricks to scare off their opponents. Now, he wanted to use the same method to make him give up the victory that was about to be in his hands. Was that even possible? Therefore, Baiwuxi felt that Xiaoyang had probably reached his limit. That was why he said such words. As for the outcome, it seemed like it would be decided in a matter of moments. Thinking of this, the anger in Baiwuxi's heart burned even brighter. It was as if he couldn't stop. As he crazily increased his strength, the godly sword trembled faster and faster. It was as if it could shatter at any moment. Baiwuxi was the happiest person in this situation, because he felt that he only needed to increase his strength a little more, and victory would be right in front of him. Now, Xiaoyang was under even more pressure, because it was a little difficult to control so much power at once. Kid, you must be in a lot of pain. You can't let go now, but you can't not let go either. Haha. Baiwuxi's laughter became even crazier. No matter how you deal with that hot potato, you won't have a good ending. The corners of Xiaoyang's mouth curled up as he said, "Why are you so confident?" His tone was still very relaxed. It was as if he was the one looking down on others. Baiwuxi couldn't help but be stunned. He felt that if this person could still maintain such a mentality at this point, it was obvious how terrifying his mentality was. An opponent like this was indeed an extremely difficult existence to deal with. Who doesn't know how to talk big? Baiwuxi snorted coldly and retorted. Xiaoyang smiled and shook his head. Even though his arm was a little numb from the shock, he still didn't panic at all. Soon after, a sharp glint appeared in his eyes. It was as if everything was under his control, and the outcome was already decided. Xiaoyang shook his wrist. Immediately, the endless thunderbolts were cut in half by the godly sword. The sword aura that was emitted directly isolated them. Then I'll let you have a taste of your own methods. Xiao Yang sneered and slashed out with his sword. This slash was incomparably resolute. Suddenly, with a dragon's roar, an incomparably huge lightning dragon rushed out from the godly sword. It bared its fangs and brandished its claws. The thunder dragon roared again and again. It coiled around its body and charged forward, as if there was no turning back. Bai Wuxi's eyes widened when he saw the lightning dragon charging towards him. This was because he didn't expect that his attack would actually return. However, this time he was the one being attacked. What kind of method was this? Countless doubts appeared in Bai Wuxi's heart. Because he didn't have time to think, he was a little confused and found it hard to accept. However, the attack arrived in an instant. Bai Wuxi didn't have time to think of a backup plan. He quickly waved the lightning whip in his hand. Right now, he could only block the lightning dragon. If he was hit, the consequences would be unimaginable. Bai Wuxi knew what was more important and what was more important. Everything happened too suddenly, but he had no choice but to deal with it. He couldn't even make any mistakes. It was just that the technique he used in a panic was simply unable to block this attack that had been prepared for a long time and was at the peak of its power accumulation. Under the attack of the lightning dragon, the lightning disappeared in the blink of an eye. It was as if it had never appeared. Bai Wuxi could only watch helplessly as the lightning dragon passed through his body. Chapter 2280. Bai Wuxi never thought that he would be attacked by his own attack. Moreover, he couldn't resist it. Why is this happening? Bai Wuxi couldn't figure it out, but he could only guard his heart and constantly control his strength to resist. The power of this lightning dragon was many times stronger than the one Bai Wuxi had unleashed before. This was because the power of the lightning dragon was also continuously increasing as it competed with the other party. In just a few breaths of time, Bai Wuxi's body suddenly expanded and revealed his original appearance. He roared and grabbed the thunder dragon with both hands, but he couldn't hold it. Under the intense pain, Bai Wuxi roared again and again, but he could only continue to restrict the thunder dragon and wear down its power to prevent irreparable damage to himself. Xiao Yang used the Thunder Fire Divine sword to support his body, so he didn't fall. Previously, he was bombarded by lightning and then had to absorb the opponent's power. It was very taxing on his mind. The current Xiao Yang could be said to be exhausted and unable to continue. Otherwise, how could he miss such a great opportunity? However, Xiao Yang wasn't sure if this move would be able to kill Bai Wuxi. This was because he wasn't sure about it, but he could only watch and see. At the same time, Xiao Yang immediately circulated his mental cultivation method and began to adjust the power in his body to ensure that he could follow up with a follow-up attack and kill Bai Wuxi directly to prevent future troubles. Perhaps it was because he was anxious, but Xiao Yang also seemed to be very anxious. But he also understood the principle of being impatient, so he was very anxious in his heart. Seeing that the great opportunity was slipping away bit by bit, he became more and more anxious in his heart. In a moment, the Thunder Dragon's power was exhausted, and Bai Wuxi finally withstood it. However, his spirit had also become much more dispirited. There were only a few hairs left on his body, but the white hairs were completely charred. There was even a smell of meat in the air. Although Bai Wuxi completely withstood these injuries, the consumption of his power was also very terrifying. Looking at the young man, his eyes were filled with killing intent. Everything had happened too quickly. Sometimes a flash of inspiration in a battle was enough to push the process forward and make it develop even faster. In fact, it was not impossible for it to develop to the end. After suffering such a huge loss, Bai Wuxi's heart could no longer remain calm. With his half-step tier 4 strength, he was actually beaten into such a sorry state by this fellow. If word got out, it would be a joke. Bai Wuxi had never thought that he would laugh at Bai Li Feng and Bai Li Zhen for being trash. Who would have thought that he would also join them today? Suddenly, Bai Wuxi shook his head, because he felt that those two fellows had already lost their lives. That was something that was set in stone. However, he was still alive. Furthermore, No one else knew about what had happened here. Therefore, as long as he killed Xiaoyang, everything would be covered up. At that time, he would still be the Bai Wuxi who stood out from the crowd. It could be said that Bai Wuxi's future was very bright. As long as he took one step at a time, he would naturally become the leader of the Bai family. That was what everyone thought. Therefore, how could he be defeated here? Such a humiliating battle record naturally could not exist in his life. Otherwise, it would definitely become a huge joke in the future. How could he accept that? Therefore, all of this needed to be put to an end. However, looking at the young man, although he looked mentally and physically exhausted, his battle intent did not lessen at all. It was obvious that he still wanted to fight. Therefore, Bai Wuxi had to think more. After all, this place was Xiaoyang's territory. As for what other tricks he had up his sleeve, it was still unknown. This was his home ground. Naturally, there would be many conveniences. The more Bai Wuxi thought about it, the more apprehension he had. He needed to plan before making a decision. He did not dare to act rashly. Perhaps it was nothing before, but after this battle, he realized that his opponent was indeed an existence that could threaten his life. Therefore, how could he underestimate him? Bai Wuxi's heart was full of helplessness. Who would have thought of such an ending? Xiaoyang raised his head and looked at Bai Wuxi, who had revealed his original appearance. The smile on his face was also full of killer's intent. Now that the opportunity had been created, how to kill this invading beast would depend on what was to be done next. Xiaoyang had almost recovered and could barely fight. He stood up straight and waved the heavenly sword in his hand. His battle intent was immediately apparent. The two energies lingered around the sword, forming sword energy in an orderly manner. After seeing this, Bai Wuxi couldn't help but frown. He really couldn't understand how a human cultivator with a weak body could still continue to fight at this point. Fella, keep pretending. You want to scare me away like this? Aren't you a little too naive? Bai Wuxi shouted angrily. The young man still looked disdainful and said, If you say so, then so be it. Now, Xiaoyang no longer had the mood to continue arguing with his opponent. After all, at this point, the only thing left was to kill. What was the point of saying so much? Hearing this, Bai Wuxi began to quickly calculate in his heart. He also felt that his opponent didn't seem to be deliberately mystifying. At least from his current attitude, he really wanted to kill. Can he really kill me? Such a strange question appeared in Bai Wuxi's heart. Right now, his injuries were indeed quite serious. If the previous attack came again, his life would naturally be in danger. After connecting many things together, Bai Wuxi quickly came up with various possibilities in his heart. In the future, he would become the leader of the Bai bloodline and completely unify the White Bear tribe. He would even go further and become the strongest tribe in the Myriad Beast realm. How could he fall in this place? At this time, Xiaoyang also slashed out with his sword. He didn't care about anything. It was as if he had completely carried out the reckless man's idea. There was no need to think so much. As long as he slashed out with his sword, killing the opponent was the most important thing. Bai Wuxi gritted his teeth and immediately turned to flee. He didn't want to continue fighting. Chapter 2281. That human cultivator's aura was simply too strong. Moreover, that brave and ruthless attitude of his made it seem like he wouldn't stop until he was dead. It was as if he wasn't afraid of death at all. Therefore, Bai Wuxi was a little scared. He was scared because he thought he had a bright future ahead of him. He didn't need to risk his life here. That kind of method was truly foolish. Thus, leaving and not giving the opponent a chance was the best choice. Plus, it was just a small drifting cloud realm. So what if there was a Xiaoyang? So what if he could kill a third-level martial king? Bai Wuxi could just go back to his tribe and ask for a fourth-level cultivator to come and crush him. In fact, it would only take a moment for the Four Realms Alliance to be completely disintegrated and ruled. There was no point in fighting to the death now. If he were to lose his life as well, it would not be worth it at all. Therefore, Bai Wuxi was very clear about these problems. He also knew what to do. That was the best choice. There was no need to pay too much for a small-scale invasion. Even if everyone in the White Bear tribe could die in the drifting cloud realm, Wuxi couldn't. Too many hopes had been placed on him. He saw all of this as his glory and the path he had to walk in the future. Therefore, after weighing the pros and cons, it was naturally no longer a problem to make a choice. He also knew what was the best choice, although it was humiliating to be defeated. What was the point of thinking if he lost his life? The strength of his opponent was undeniable. Moreover, victory and defeat were common occurrences in the military, so what reason was there to brood over it? With these thoughts in mind, Wuxi could be said to have thought of many excuses on his own. Therefore, he didn't think much of this defeat. He even felt at ease. Xiao Yang didn't expect this guy to be so arrogant and have everything under his control. Now, he didn't even care about being embarrassed. He just turned around and ran. This really made everyone's jaws drop. However, Wuxi had already discovered the existence of the world's spirit vein and was even interested in it. Thus, Xiao Yang definitely couldn't let him leave the flowing cloud world alive. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable. Therefore, the current Wuxi had to die. At the very least, Xiao Yang was now completely intent on killing. If he could not take the latter's life and leave behind a calamity, then the drifting cloud world would be a great disaster. Wuxi couldn't help but frown when he sensed Xiao Yang's relentless pursuit. He had never thought that this hothead's killing intent would be so heavy. Even now, it seemed that he was still unwilling to let him go. Wuxi was complaining incessantly in his heart. How could he have imagined that he would provoke such a lunatic? Now, even he felt a little unlucky. Don't push your luck. I'm kind enough to let you go. Do you really think you can do it? Wuxi scolded loudly. However, he didn't turn around and continued to charge forward. Perhaps only Wuxi could use the most embarrassing actions to say the most unyielding words. Of course, Wuxi had no choice. If he didn't cherish his life, he could have fought. However, he didn't want to fight because he couldn't see a clear ending. After all, he would only fight if he was confident in winning the battle. This was because he needed to be undefeated. Once the risk was too great, he wasn't willing to take it. Otherwise, he might have to pay a terrible price. How could he accept such a thing? Wuxi had already made a decision in his heart about what to do. I don't need you to let me go. Come back and kill me, Xiao Yang immediately replied. Although he felt that the possibility of using words to make Wuxi turn around wasn't very high, he still had to try. If he was lucky enough to succeed, then he would have profited. Hearing those words, Wuxi flew into a rage. If it weren't for his terrifying self-control, he would have turned around and fought. However, that was impossible now. Wuxi's weapon was extremely strange. Not only could it absorb his power, but it could also return it. As such, he didn't have much of a chance of winning this battle. It could be said that as long as Xiao Yang didn't make too serious of a mistake, it wouldn't be easy to kill him. Wuxi couldn't accept the fact that the battle was getting more and more uncertain. Furthermore, in his opinion, this threat was truly too great. Wuxi had never thought that he would encounter someone who was at a higher level than him one day. In fact, he wasn't even a match for him. Such a huge gap made him very sensitive and helpless. Don't you want to have the world's spiritual vein? If you kill me, you'll be unimpeded. But now, you're running for your life. What's the meaning of this? Xiao Yang scolded. Wuxi frowned slightly, and a few rays of light flashed in his eyes. He was taking the risk now to enjoy the world spiritual vein alone. However, was he going to give up now? Wuxi's heart was very heavy. When he considered this problem, he was very worried. He was naturally unwilling, but he had no choice but to continue running. Seeing that Wuxi didn't reply, Xiao Yang could only continue to pursue him. In the time it takes to brew a pot of tea, he would be able to catch up to him. However, in less than 10 minutes, Wuxi suddenly turned around and stopped running. His whole body was filled with battle intent. There must be a reason for this abnormality. Xiao Yang also quickly stopped and looked at Bai Wuxi with vigilance. Bai Wuxi's previous posture of running was so embarrassing. He wanted to leave this place wholeheartedly, but now he stopped running. Was he prepared to fight to the death, or was he prepared? Although Xiao Yang wanted to kill him very much, he still needed to remain calm. After all, challenging someone at a higher level was like walking on a tightrope. Once there was a mistake, he would lose his life. In that case, how could he not worry and be cautious? I already said that I'll let you go. Why do you have to rush to your death? Bai Wuxi snorted coldly. His eyes were full of killing intent. This made Xiao Yang immediately start to observe the surroundings. He always felt that Bai Wuxi's escape was just to set up a trap. Let me show you the power of my wind and thunder array. Chapter 2282. At this moment, Bai Wuxi's confidence returned. Between his eyebrows, there was a trace of extremely strong hostility. Right now, Bai Wuxi was indeed very angry. This was because Xiao Yang had been chasing after him all this time. How could he not be angry? Originally, Bai Wuxi thought that if he left, he would die and there was no need to be entangled with him. However, Xiao Yang was unwilling to let him go. As a result, there was no other way. The arrangements that he had made in this place could naturally be put to good use. This was what it meant when you refused to take the path to heaven and chose to enter hell. Instantly, waves and waves of wind and thunder energy rose. With Xiao Yang as the center, they trapped him within. At this moment, the thunder became even more powerful. Perhaps with the help of the wind, its prestige became even more tyrannical. In an instant, sand and stones flew everywhere, and the sky darkened. Xiao Yang stood in the middle of the array with his brows tightly knitted together. At this moment, he realized that he had been too anxious and careless. Since Bai Wuxi was a person who liked to plan before making a decision, how could he not have prepared a way out? In fact, all of these could have been prevented. However, because Xiao Yang's killing intent was too strong, he neglected these things, causing him to be trapped. Even so, Xiao Yang did not panic at all. As the saying goes, counter soldiers with arms and water with an earth weir. That was all there was to it. Moreover, the situation had only become more troublesome. It had not reached the point of no return. In terms of formations, Xiao Yang had his own unique understanding. This formation could only trap him for a short while. Breaking the formation was not wishful thinking. It just needed some time. However, Xiao Yang had to consider more and think further. After all, he had encountered a wind and thunder formation before leaving the central peak. If he continued to move forward, who knew what kind of strange formations he would encounter? Moreover, since the other party had prepared a way out, there might be more. These were all things that needed careful consideration. Because the middle peak had yet to fully recover its vitality, it was uninhabited. Once they reached a densely populated city and activated the formation, many people would probably lose their lives. Therefore, killing his opponent in the middle of the mountain was the safest way to go about it. However, due to the obstruction of the formation, it was not an easy task to kill him in one strike. Xiao Yang was also a little worried because he didn't have a definite idea, so he didn't dare to act rashly. As such, he was worried about how to do this. The smile on Bai Wuxi's face widened when he saw that the array had been fully activated. Because of his opponent's carelessness, he still had a chance. If even with the support of the formation, there was still no way to kill him here, then there was really nothing he could do. In fact, they could only flee, not daring to continue fighting. At this moment, Bai Wuxi already had an answer in his heart and was certain of what to do next, planning before acting. This was Bai Wuxi's character. Therefore, he was confident again, which was why he dared to stay here and try to kill Xiao Yang. You don't know what's good for you. Now you know how powerful I am. Bai Wu, she shouted in a low voice. Suddenly, his qi became even more powerful. His heart, which had already fallen to the bottom of the valley, was once again ignited. In fact, He even felt that it wouldn't be difficult for him to win. Everything was back in his control again. This was a wonderful feeling for Bai Wuxi. Xiao Yang snorted disdainfully and said, "Do you think it's possible to defeat me with such means?" After saying that, Xiao Yang looked at the Thunder Fire Divine sword in his hand. Bai Wuxi naturally noticed this detail. The sword was very strange, and it could even absorb the power of lightning. In that case, the lightning element was probably not very useful to it. Thinking of this, Bai Wuxi's frown deepened. The sword's effect could be said to restrain their talent. All of a sudden, Bai Wuxi realized that the deaths of Bailey Zhen and Bailey Feng were most likely due to the same reason. In that case, it was not that their cultivation was too low, but that they were unlucky and met their nemesis. Do you think you can break my formation like this? Do you think it's so simple? Since I can use this formation to deal with you, how can it not have other magical uses? Bai Wuxi said, and his expression became more and more fierce. This was also a sign of Bai Wuxi's panic. The divine sword was indeed not very friendly to him. Therefore, he had to consider more things and problems now. Otherwise, if there were more unforeseen events, he was afraid that he would have more scars on his body. It was not impossible for him to lose his life in this place. Xiao Yang just smiled faintly. At the same time, he quickly spread out his divine sense and began to search for the weakness of the formation. As long as he could find it, breaking the formation was just a matter of a few moves. For cultivators who had turned into ferocious beasts, it was inevitable that they were inferior to human cultivators in terms of formation, alchemy, and weapon refining. However, Bai Wuxi was a complete exception. That was because his aptitude was also extraordinary. It was because of this that Bai Wuxi was favored by the White Bear tribe. He was favored by the elders and respected by the juniors. It seems that you won't give up until all hope is gone. Fine, I'll let you see the tip of the iceberg. Bai Wuxi said, and the corners of his mouth rose slightly. Then, Bai Wuxi directly threw the Thunder Whip into the Wind and Thunder formation. After the Thunder Whip entered the Wind and Thunder formation, it twisted a few times and directly turned into a huge thunder dragon. It twisted and turned, and its momentum was terrifying. Perhaps because of the Wind and Thunder formation support, its momentum became even more powerful, as if it was unshakable. Even Xiao Yang was a little dumbfounded at the scene. In this way, the Wind and Thunder formation's power was strengthened again, and it would not be easy to deal with it. The thunder dragon roared to the sky, and the sound of the dragon's roar was so loud that it almost deafened people's ears. Bai Wuxi, on the other hand, stood there leisurely. He wanted to see what kind of trouble this kid could stir up. Since he was so aggressive, he naturally had to pay the price. Chapter 2283. Looking at the lightning dragon, Xiao Yang's eyebrows furrowed slightly. The plan in his heart had already formed a framework. However, there were still some details that he hadn't thought through yet. However, it was obvious that Bai Wuxi wasn't going to give Xiao Yang any time to react. Instead, he directly urged the Thunder Dragon to attack. The Thunder Dragon roared and charged straight at Xiao Yang. Because it was caused by a magic weapon, its power couldn't be underestimated. It was extremely powerful. In addition, it was a spiritual weapon and had already developed a trace of spiritual intelligence. It was a little difficult to deal with. The controller didn't need to spend too much energy. He only needed to give a command. When the Thunder Dragon was about to arrive, Xiao Yang directly used the barbarian god's 7 steps and stepped on the Thunder Dragon's head. No matter how the lightning bombarded him, he turned a deaf ear to it. The divine sword in his hand was directly nailed to the dragon's head. At most, he would repeat the same trick and use the characteristics of the Thunder Fire Divine sword to drain all the power of the Thunder Whip. If there was no power, then all of this would be empty talk. As long as the Thunder Fire Divine sword could absorb enough power, then the power that would erupt would be even more violent. At that time, it would be very possible to kill him in one blow. There were many things that had to be tried before the results could be known. Bai Wuxi saw that Xiaoyang was repeating the same trick and laughed again. This was because he felt that this method was a little too childish. Previously, he was at a disadvantage because he didn't know the reason. How could he, Bai Wuxi, fall at the same place twice? Break! Bai Wuxi shouted in a low voice and cast a spell. Suddenly, the thunder dragon suddenly went crazy. Its whole body was constantly erupting with lightning, and it seemed to be unstoppable. Even someone as strong as Xiaoyang couldn't stand firm and was directly thrown out. The moment he was thrown out, countless wind blades attacked him. They were so dense that it seemed like they were going to cut him into powder. In the face of such a strong attack, Xiaoyang immediately took a breath and used it to block the attack of these wind blades. Although Xiaoyang's body was very tough, if he were to take the full brunt of these wind blades, he might not be seriously injured. However, the number of wind blades wasn't small. If they all hit him, he would be minced into a pile of minced meat. That might be a light statement. On the other side, the Thunder Fire Divine Sword was wrapped around the Thunder Fire Divine Sword. It was still constantly compressing it, was as if it wanted to break this divine sword. Bai Wuxi's only purpose of throwing the Thunder Fire Divine Sword was to entangle the Thunder Fire Divine Sword. The Thunder Fire Divine Swords, Fire Divine Swords, Fire Divine Swords, Divine Swords, Divine Swords. No matter how powerful a toothless tiger was, could it still be considered a tiger? This was Bai Wuxi's goal, and he had achieved it. Therefore, this made his heart extremely resolute. Moreover, he was certain that he would win this time. Without anything to rely on, no matter how strong you are, what's the point of that? Those wind blades could be said to be incomparably sharp. The impact was also not to be underestimated. Under the countless bombardments, the Thunder Fire Divine Sword's divine sword became full of cracks. In an instant, it shattered. Xiaoyang's body also had countless wounds because of this. Every wind blade that passed by would leave a wound on Xiaoyang's body. Looking at his opponent's current sorry state, the smile on Bai Wuxi's face became even more satisfied. This was the result he wanted. How could he not be happy about it? The originally slim chance of winning had returned to 80 to 90% at this moment. As for some other accidents, he also suppressed them. He didn't believe that Xiaoyang had any means to deal with him. However, in the next moment, Bai Wuxi's brows furrowed again. This was because he sensed that although the Thunder Fire Divine Sword was not in Xiaoyang's hands, it was still constantly absorbing the power of the Thunder Fire Whip. This was something that Bai Wuxi didn't expect, but he felt that something was wrong. However, his rationality told him that everything was within his expectations. There was no problem. After Xiaoyang stabilized his body, he kept shuttling back and forth in the formation. He used a very exquisite body technique to avoid the attacks. However, he couldn't avoid all of them. Every time he moved, he paid extra attention. Sometimes he would throw out a few punches to test the formation. After a few attempts, his brows furrowed even more tightly. This was because he couldn't find any clues. You don't have to struggle. I've improved this formation more than 100 times. I've hidden all the formation legs and formation eyes. If you want to find a flaw in it, you don't have to waste any more effort. Indeed, if I didn't have the wind-thunder diagram, it would be difficult to find the key to break the formation, Bai Wuxi said proudly. He felt refreshed when he saw that his opponent was very helpless in the formation and could only flee in panic. Of course, this wind-thunder formation was indeed something that Bai Wuxi was proud of. This was because he had reached a very high level of achievement in this formation. He had even become famous in the realm of beasts because of this set of formation. This set of formation was recorded in the realm of beasts' merit book. The reason why Bai Wuxi's status could be elevated to an extremely special level was more or less inseparable from this formation. Your formation is only SOSO, Xiaoyang said jokingly. However, Xiaoyang was very certain in his heart. Bai Wuxi's formation really didn't have any flaws. Its exquisiteness was much better than that of some people who were good at formations. It had to be said that Bai Wuxi was really an anomaly in the white bear tribe. He was obviously a ferocious beast, but his brain was extremely sharp. Now, even Xiaoyang had a headache. Although he had found some flaws, it wasn't enough to break through it. This made Xiaoyang feel conflicted for a long time. He didn't know if he should test it out. However, sometimes testing would also bring disaster to himself. After all, if Bai Wuxi found a clue, would he still let him break the formation so leisurely? Just by thinking about it, one would know that it was completely impossible. In the next moment, Xiaoyang decided to give it a try. He directly threw out a punch and aimed at a protruding hill below. He was very determined. Chapter 2284. Boom! The power of the punch shattered countless wind blades and lightning bolts, turning the protruding mountain into powder. Immediately, the wind and thunder formation shook, and in an instant, several lightning bolts bombarded his back at an extremely fast speed. Xiaoyang immediately lost control of himself and staggered a few steps forward. He looked more or less in a sorry state. Xiaoyang was closer to the power of lightning because he had consumed the dark thunder fruit. In addition, his body had been tempered by lightning, so he was partially immune to it. However, in the face of absolute strength, the skin on his back was already torn apart and charred black. Seeing this, Bai Wuxi could no longer remain calm. In fact, his eyebrows were even more furrowed. This was because he sensed that Xiaoyang seemed to have found some clues and was even probing. In this way, he couldn't continue to wait and see. You're really not simple. I didn't expect you to find the formation core so quickly, Bai Wuxi said through gritted teeth. The fact that the other party was able to find the clues so quickly made Bai Wuxi furious. This was the formation that he was proud of. In less than 15 minutes, Xiaoyang had found it. This was undoubtedly saying that his efforts were nothing more than this. The wind and thunder formation is indeed exquisite, but it's nothing to me. You're still no match for me when it comes to formations, Xiaoyang said as the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. After seeing Bai Wuxi's expression, he understood that his guess was completely correct. Therefore, he could attack according to his plan. Breaking the formation was just a short distance away. I can kill an opponent like you. However, I have no choice but to kill you, Bai Wuxi said sternly. Such a person no longer made Bai Wuxi feel lonely at the top. However, at the same time, he also felt fear. If they were in the same realm, he would probably be hung up and beaten by him. Therefore, this kind of jealousy made Bai Wuxi want nothing more than to grind his bones and scatter his ashes. Only by doing so could he vent the hatred in his heart. He, Bai Wuxi, was the strongest existence in the same realm. Even if there were people who wanted to surpass him, he had to kill them in the cradle. Because in this way, he would still be the strongest person. As long as those who were stronger and had more potential than him were gone, wouldn't that be fine? In the next moment, Bai Wuxi's hands began to move again. Since Xiaoyang had the ability to break the formation, he had to add fuel to the fire and make it burn even more fiercely. At the very least, it would be the best opportunity to kill Xiaoyang. Now that he was tired of dealing with the formation, it was naturally difficult for him to deal with his attacks. How could he block the two attacks at the same time? The groundwork was more or less done. If they didn't take his head now, they would miss this great opportunity. Bai Wuxi wasn't an indecisive person. Instead, he was very decisive. Once he made up his mind, he was like an arrow that was released from a bow. It was difficult to turn back. As the speed of the hand seals became faster and faster, the power of the wind and thunder became even more tyrannical. The aura of the two rose to the peak again at this moment. This might be the moment that determined victory or defeat, or even life or death for them. At this moment, they had to bring out all their trump cards. This was the only way to make them feel that they could still take down their opponent, even though it was a little difficult. But as long as he tried, everything was possible. The one who was under the most pressure was still Xiaoyang. This was because Bai Wuxi only had one goal, and that was to kill his opponent. It didn't matter how many mistakes he made. However, Xiaoyang had more to worry about. He couldn't even make a single mistake. This was the advantage of having a higher realm. They could make several mistakes, but as long as their opponent made one, they would be doomed eternally. As time went on, Bai Wuxi's speed became faster and faster. Under his power, the aura was suppressed. On the other hand, Xiaoyang had to constantly dodge the wind and thunder attacks. He even had to resist them. It seemed like he couldn't free himself at all. "Help me," Xiaoyang said indifferently in his heart. After the world spirit received the call, it responded immediately. Although Xiaoyang's realm was lower than his opponent's, the advantage he had made it difficult for his opponent to guard against him. Even if the world spirit didn't help him, he could still kill Bai Wuxi. However, doing so was extremely risky. When the time came, if he couldn't kill him completely, he would leave behind trouble in the future. Therefore, Xiaoyang had no choice but to ask the world spirit to help him in order to ensure that he was 100% sure of success. Some of the aura around Bai Wuxi's body had already begun to change, but he seemed to be unaware of it. Or maybe it was because he was too engrossed in his attacks that he neglected those details and didn't notice the slightest bit of danger. Or maybe, in Bai Wuxi's opinion, as long as he attacked, the situation would be completely settled. Therefore, there was not much meaning in thinking so much about it in the first place. Therefore, there was no need to think anymore. The matter was over, so it was over. Why should he think so much and worry about nothing? Especially at such a crucial moment, he would often delay himself because of thinking too much. Fury of 1,000 thunderbolts of evil. Bai Wuxi roared angrily. Suddenly, the wind and thunder array became extremely dark. Countless gusts of wind rose abruptly, like a hurricane, constantly rotating. Everything that entered the array turned into dust in the blink of an eye. Lightning pierced through the array, as if it was ready to blast the young man into ashes. One rose from the ground, and the other fell from the sky. It could be said to be a pincer attack, making it impossible for the young man to go up and down. He could only wait in midair for the two forces to attack and turn him into ashes. Bai Wuxi was still controlling everything with his great mental strength. If Xiaoyang wasn't turned into ashes, he wouldn't dare to let his guard down. After all, this guy had too many possibilities, and he didn't dare to make the slightest mistake. Xiaoyang casually opened his hand, and immediately several magic weapons appeared in his hand. He threw them at the wind and thunder. In the next moment, with a thought, the Thunder Fire Divine sword suddenly broke free from the Thunder Whip's restraint and directly returned to Xiaoyang's hand. It was extremely powerful. Thunder Prison True Fire Kill. Chapter 2285. At this moment, the power between the heavens and the earth changed once again. The wind blades suddenly began to shatter. As for the evil wind below, it was difficult to dispel due to its extremely strong cohesion. However, its might had already been greatly reduced. The atmosphere here had also undergone an earth-shattering change due to some subtle changes. It was as if everything that was originally destined had disappeared. At this moment, Bai Wuxi also noticed the huge change. He couldn't understand what was going on, but all he could do was continue to exert force with both hands and increase the strength of all his hands. Only in this way could he completely kill his opponent. Moreover, this was the beginning of his plan. He couldn't allow any accidents to happen. Sometimes things were so simple. As long as he was ruthless, it would be enough to solve it. Moreover, at this moment of life and death, if he hesitated or denied the beauty of the previous plan, it would probably become an obstacle to his mental state. It might even evolve continuously and become his stumbling block in the end. Therefore, Bai Wuxi already had an answer in his heart. Therefore, he knew what he should do to achieve the best effect and prevent it from rebounding. In the blink of an eye, Xiaoyang also formed a seal. Immediately, the entire wind and thunder formation began to tremble. The foundation of the wind and thunder formation was in the drifting cloud realm. Then, the ability of the world spirit was to control the drifting cloud realm. Therefore, the location of the formation I was no longer a secret. This was something that could be destroyed with just a glance and an intention. In order to form this sure-kill plan, Xiaoyang had put in a lot of effort. Fortunately, this time, after a precise calculation, he did it. He succeeded in making Bai Wuxi fight with his life on the line. He wanted to kill him, so there was no way out. As the power of wind and thunder got closer, Xiaoyang also attacked with his sword. When he attacked with his sword, there was a sudden burst of fire. Countless flaming sword auras spread out around him. These sword auras seemed to pierce through the sky. They were unstoppable. In the sky, a huge net was formed in the blink of an eye. However, this net was completely formed by lightning, and it was extremely powerful. This was all with the help of the world spirit. They used some of the power of the world. Therefore, the power of this move could be raised to such a terrifying level. At this moment, Bai Wuxi's expression changed. He never thought that his advantage would crumble in an instant. He now understood that in this world, what he did was going against the heavens. So, he was rejected by the heavens and the earth, and it caused the might of the techniques he executed to be greatly reduced. Bai Wuxi began to panic. He had never thought that the world would deal such a heavy blow to him when he was about to win. However, Bai Wuxi didn't know that Xiaoyang had the ability to control this world. It was just that he didn't want to reveal too much, so he hid it. Everything was nothing more than a scheme to pave the way for the final killing blow. Seeing the lightning net getting closer and closer, the panic in Bai Wuxi's heart grew. However, there was no way out for him. He knew very well that as long as he killed Xiaoyang, so what if this world rejected him? You can't kill me anyway. The only one who can kill me is Xiaoyang. Bai Wuxi hated risking his life like this. However, he had already quietly walked to this step. There was no way out. He could only gamble with all his strength. What if he succeeded? Thus, no matter how flustered Bai Wuxi was, he wasn't flustered in the slightest when dealing with matters. Boom! The originally domineering wind and thunder array was extremely fragile under this sword. It was pierced directly. It was almost impossible for the formation to continue. Countless amounts of energy lost control and exploded, forming a huge storm that was attacking in different directions. It was extremely terrifying. Xiaoyang was still charging forward, allowing the wind blades formed by the evil wind to cut his body or the lightning to bombard him. Seeing that his opponent's sword was getting closer and closer to his heart, Bai Wuxi's heart was in a complete panic. The result that he didn't want to see the most had finally come to pass. Bai Wuxi's mouth twitched. He wanted to retreat, but there was no longer any possibility of that. That was because the lightning net had completely shrunk and trapped him within. TSK. The sword pierced Bai Wuxi's heart directly. Immediately, countless flaming sword qis pierced into his body. Bai Wuxi watched as the sword qi continued to erase his life force. His heart was filled with regret and doubt. How did he end up like this? He couldn't understand why things had turned out this way. He looked at the young man again. There was only tenacity on his face. Even though he was covered in wounds, he didn't utter a single word. He was like a machine that didn't know pain. Xiaoyang's state of mind was also very calm. He knew very well that if his hand trembled, it might lead to insufficient power and he wouldn't be able to kill his opponent. Therefore, if he wanted to prevent future troubles, he had to make this attack perfect and seal off all of his opponent's opportunities. Lightning and evil wind still rampaged between heaven and earth. However, the person who had done so was unable to move in the slightest. He could only look at the sword. In the blink of an eye, his eyes revealed a trace of ruthlessness and determination. He opened his mouth, and a white light flashed, directly piercing Xiaoyang's neck. Xiaoyang still didn't move. He just let the blood flow. As long as a martial emperor didn't die, even if his head was cut off, it could be reattached. Such a small injury to him was nothing. However, in the next moment, Xiaoyang's neck stiffened. That was because the white light still carried an extremely strong murderous aura. Moreover, it was smeared with poison. This was one of the trump cards that Bai Wuxi had left for him. However, Xiaoyang still stood there, unmoving like the setting sun. It was as if his injury was nothing to worry about. Or perhaps he didn't think it was a big deal and didn't need to take it to heart. Chapter 2286. In the blink of an eye, Xiaoyang's neck had turned black. It was a horrible sight, but he still maintained his motionless posture like a statue. However, Bai Wuxi's heart was filled with despair. How could he have known that this guy was such a fugitive? Could it be that he didn't even think of a way out? Did he just want to die together with him? For a time, the scenes of the past kept appearing in his heart. Bai Wuxi also realized that it would be difficult for him to escape this disaster. Until now, he still couldn't figure out which part of the plan went wrong to lead to this ending. There were clearly no problems with the arrangements. After tonight, the flowing cloud domain would completely fall. However, he was going to lose his life here. Moreover, this person's strength was unfathomable. He was only a second-level martial king, but he was able to suppress him, a half-step fourth-level martial king. This kind of strength was really unfathomable, and he couldn't figure it out. What was this all about? No, I didn't lose to you. I just lost to this world. Bai Wuxi suddenly roared. He also understood the crux of the matter. Xiaoyang was originally from this world. In the face of an invasion, no matter which world it would protect its own living creatures and exclude foreign cultivators. That was why he was suppressed at that critical moment. That was why his attack, which had already been formed, was scattered. He was unable to suppress his opponent and form a sure-kill situation. The more he thought about it, the angrier Bai Wuxi became. Why did this happen? He had calculated everything to the limit, but he had forgotten to take into account the exclusion of this world. Bai Wuxi smiled. He was also very sad in his heart. He felt that all this was a bit too ridiculous. I am the representative of this world. Xiaoyang's mouth revealed a relaxed smile. Now that Bai Wuxi's vitality was almost cut off, and his strength was also almost exhausted, it was only a matter of time before he lost his life. Bai Wuxi was stunned for a moment. Then he thought of all the key points, and he couldn't help but frown. However, he suddenly understood. Why was Xiaoyang able to reach the distant southern paradise so quickly? If he could suppress his speed before sending out his troops, then why did West Wind City become an empty city? As for what exactly happened in Spring Sun City, he wasn't sure. Perhaps it was a problem with the orders. Presumably, it was because Xiaoyang knew everything. That was why he was able to give out orders at the first moment and coordinate everything to the best of his ability. Moreover, he had been very careful when he came to the Middle Mountain. He had even used a magic robe to conceal his aura, so no one would be able to detect him. But why did he rush over in time? Bai Wuxi smiled. Now, the doubts in his heart had been completely resolved. He still boasted that he had calculated everything, but there were still many things that he hadn't calculated. Moreover, this was also the reason why he had sacrificed his life. If he had thought of this earlier, he would not have fallen here, right? As Bai Wuxi thought of this, he felt a little uncomfortable. Was it really like what this young man said? He was too smart for his own good? Everything had become a foregone conclusion. He had no chance or possibility to turn the tables. However, the scenes of the past kept appearing in front of his eyes. Bai Wuxi also saw a lot of things because of this. For example, the ambitions when he was young and the beautiful future that he could envision now. However, everything seemed to have come to an end here, and all of this had nothing to do with him anymore. No. Bai Wuxi suddenly roared. He couldn't accept this reality. He was extremely unwilling. What was the point of losing his life like this? He still had countless grand plans to experiment, so how could he fall in this place? Am I really in a situation of certain death right now? No, he still had a chance. Boy, I want to fight with you again. In this aspect, you are definitely not my opponent. Bai Wuxi suddenly laughed wildly. However, that laughter came to an abrupt end in the blink of an eye. As for Bai Wuxi's body, it had completely lost all vitality and turned into a cold corpse. A white light directly rushed into Xiao Yang's head and entered his sea of consciousness. This was the only way Bai Wuxi could think of to survive now. As long as he could possess Xiao Yang's body, he could still continue to live. However, Xiao Yang would die. Who knows, he might be able to use Xiao Yang's body to do even more things if he planned carefully. Xiao Yang only smiled faintly. It was as if he did not care about everything that had happened. Or perhaps, to him, this was an insignificant matter to begin with. That was why he was so indifferent. Ji Fei was lying limply on the ground on Mount Exquisite Victory. He looked extremely exhausted. Shen Wushuang, Chu Nanfeng, and the others were also here. Even the motionless First Lunar Shadow and Shao Clan's great master Shao Chongsheng had also come. At that critical moment, all the martial emperors from the drifting cloud realm came here at the same time to help Ji Fei. That was how they managed to defend against Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang's joint attack with great difficulty. Although everyone had joined in, the battle was still very tense. It was difficult to determine the winner in such a short time. In this battle, the martial emperors from both sides would conduct themselves with dignity. However, many of King Wu's warriors had sacrificed themselves in this battle. In the end, if Xiao Hua had not returned in time and scared Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang into fleeing, they would have lost the battle. With their combined efforts, they managed to defend against tonight's extremely powerful attack. "Old Prime Minister, are you all right?" Shen Wushuang asked. The old Prime Minister lay on the ground and shook his head, saying, "I'm fine. When Master Xiao comes back, ask for some pills. I'm sure it won't take long for me to recover." At the same time, the old Prime Minister chuckled bitterly. Tonight's attack was indeed too dangerous. If they had not received Xiao Yang's order to come to the rescue in time, Summit Victory Mountain would have fallen. It could even be said that no mistake could be made in any detail. If there were any loopholes, it could lead to a situation where a 1,000-mile dike would be destroyed by a single anthole. "I wonder what kind of trouble Xiao Yang encountered," Shen Wushuang said softly. Chapter 2287 Thousand Beast Realm, White Bear Tribe. In a brightly lit room, a middle-aged man was stroking a jade pendant with a faint smile on his face. He seemed very satisfied. He seemed to have thought of something extremely happy, which was why he had such an expression. Suddenly, the jade pendant in his hand shattered. A trace of blood flowed out and dyed his hand red. The middle-aged man looked at the shattered jade pendant in a daze. Perhaps it was because he couldn't accept it, but his eyes were filled with shock. The essence blood in this jade pendant was from the junior he was most satisfied with. This jade pendant could also correspond to that person's situation. But now, this jade pendant had shattered. The person he had high hopes for had probably suffered the same fate as this jade pendant. However, he couldn't understand why this was the case. He was just leading an expedition to Flowing Cloud Realm. How luxurious was that lineup for a small realm? Furthermore, with his intelligence, how could he possibly allow his physical body to disappear? There's nothing wrong with cutting off your tail to survive. As long as you can protect your soul, you'll be fine. The middle-aged man suddenly stood up as he spoke. His eyes were already looking into the distance. The middle-aged man didn't know the specifics of the situation, but he knew that something big must have happened, which was why it was like this. Otherwise, how could he have been forced to abandon his body? Not long after, a person hurriedly rushed over and knelt on the ground, reporting to Master. Halfway through his sentence, the man felt as if his throat was being choked, and he was unable to continue. When the middle-aged man saw this, his entire body trembled. He stepped back step by step. His eyes were filled with disbelief. Did something happen to Shi? The middle-aged man suddenly roared. The black-clothed person who rushed and knelt on the ground. His body was trembling. It was as if he didn't dare to say this news. The black-clothed person was also very conflicted, because he really didn't know if he should say these words, not to mention the master. Even he found it hard to believe. He felt that his eyes were playing tricks on him. But how could he be wrong after confirming it again and again? "Speak!" The middle-aged man roared angrily when he saw this. The black-clothed man was so scared that his heart was about to burst. However, under the pressure, he had no choice but to speak slowly. Mr. Bai's beast fire has been extinguished." After saying this, the black-clothed man suddenly screamed and stopped breathing. The middle-aged man looked at the blood that was slowly seeping out of the ground, and his brows were almost knitted together. The murderous intent and vicious aura on his body were not concealed at all, and could be said to have soared into the sky. All of a sudden, the entire White Bear tribe seemed to have sensed the fury of this almighty being. Everyone was in a state of panic. Flowing cloud realm. What kind of trouble can a small, drifting cloud realm cause? The middle-aged man gnashed his teeth as he spoke. With another palm strike, he directly smashed the corpse into fine powder. Originally, the middle-aged man was still planning the best path for his family's junior. After returning from the expedition to the flowing cloud realm, he could confirm that he was comparable to a stage for martial king. But now this person was gone just like that. Flowing cloud realm, I want all of you to be buried with my Shi'er. The middle-aged man roared again, and the murderous intent in his eyes became more and more dignified. The junior that he thought highly of was gone just like that. It was really hard for him to accept. It was like that trace of hope had been completely destroyed. Baiwuxi struggled with all his might, but it was useless. In the battle, he was not a match for Xiaoyang. In the contest of divine souls, with his little strength, he naturally could not be compared to Xiaoyang and contend against him. After all, the most terrifying thing about Xiaoyang was that his divine soul was strong enough. Therefore, Baiwuxi's desperate move was tantamount to walking right into a trap and seeking his own death. Originally, Xiaoyang still had a trick up his sleeve to prevent Baiwuxi's divine soul from escaping. But his mind was thinking about seizing the body, which saved Xiaoyang a lot of effort. Because Baiwuxi knew about the magical effects of the world's spirit vein, Xiaoyang had to let his soul scatter. Otherwise, if he were to return to life and spread the news, the flowing cloud realm would probably be faced with an endless stream of attacks. Therefore, under such circumstances, he could only be ruthless and let him be consigned to eternal damnation. Otherwise, with the greed of the human heart, the flowing cloud realm would definitely be targeted by others when the time came. Sometimes it was not a big deal to directly come and snatch it. After all, Xiaoyang could still fight with him and protect him in this way. But if he was always remembered by others, it might be difficult for him to leave. At that time, this would also form a great restriction on Xiaoyang. It could be said that if Baiwuxi did not discover the secret of the world's spirit vein, Xiaoyang could still let him go. At that time, he could continue to fight with him at Pin, Victory Mountain. In this way, he could continue to raise the enemy and maintain his dignity, which could buy him more time. However, since the other party had discovered something that should not have been discovered, such a decision would naturally be changed. After everything was settled, Xiaoyang directly sat cross-legged and began to use the power of the poison to absorb the poison on his neck. This poison was also very fierce and fierce. If it was an ordinary martial emperor, he would probably have died from the poison. However, Xiaoyang cultivated the art of poison. It was undoubtedly a fool's dream to want to kill him with poison, as the ancestor of using poison, and now he was using the power of poison to improve himself. This poison could be said to have no effect on him. In fact, the higher the grade of the poison, the more nourishing it would be for Xiaoyang. However, this poison was difficult to deal with. Even Xiaoyang spent a lot of time to completely absorb it. When he was done with everything, it was already the next morning. When the first ray of dawn shone, a new day had begun. At a glance, the middle peak was once again a scene of devastation. There were traces left by the battle everywhere. Scorched earth and deep pits were everywhere. It could be said that one after another, which was very spectacular. However, Xiaoyang felt a little desolate and even a little distressed in his heart. He had been operating in the middle peak for several years. He did not expect that everything would be destroyed with this battle. Naturally, the efforts he had put in these years would not exist anymore. The more he thought about it, the more painful Xiaoyang felt in his heart. What was this? Chapter 2288. The more he thought about it, the more Xiaoyang felt the pain in his heart. It seemed that he had to think about where to fight in the future. Otherwise, if this continued, his family's wealth would be almost completely ruined. Fortunately, he had gained a lot from this battle. As the most outstanding person of the White Bear tribe's younger generation, Baiwuxi had a lot of good things because he was being groomed as the successor. He even had 2 middle-grade spiritual chi items. Apart from the Thunder Whip, there was also a sword. The main reason he didn't use it was that it didn't have the right attribute. As for cultivation methods, elixirs, and treasures, there were too many to count. It would probably take a month to count them all. Xiaoyang naturally wouldn't do such a time-consuming thing himself. Therefore, after choosing some things that were useful to him, he put them aside and handed them over to Sun Dishing in the future so that they could count and distribute them. That was the best choice. Xiaoyang gritted his teeth as he stared at the devastated middle peak. Soon after, he threw down a handful of seeds and scattered them all over the place. As for the rest, he left it to the spirit of the world. He originally wanted to spend some time and pay a price to completely restore Middle Peak to life. However, after a few big battles, all his efforts and painstaking efforts had been destroyed. From the looks of it, it wouldn't be an easy task to completely restore the Middle Peak. However, that wasn't important. There was still a long period of war ahead. It was meaningless to think so much now. Therefore, it wouldn't be too late to think about how to develop after everything stabilized. If it was difficult to get through the present, then the future wouldn't exist. Soon after, Xiaoyang rushed back to Pin Victory Mountain as fast as he could. After returning to Pin Victory Mountain, he saw that everyone was cleaning up the battlefield. At the foot of the mountain, blood flowed like a river and corpses were everywhere. Among them, there were corpses of the White Bear tribe and their allied forces. Even with the protection of the Thousand Hearts Array, they had lost a lot of soldiers. Moreover, their casualties were much more than the enemy's. As for the specific data, they would only know after the statistics were done. When everyone saw that Xiaoyang had returned, they immediately stood up excitedly. "Master Xiao, did the leader sneak into the back?" Ji Fei asked anxiously. Xiaoyang nodded slightly, his face filled with pain. Hearing such an answer, everyone felt relieved. Sure enough, it was just as they had guessed. After defeating Bailey Z, the reason why Xiaoyang left in a hurry was because his backyard was on fire. They had defended this battle, and Xiaoyang had also returned. Naturally, the outcome of the battle was self-evident. Doesn't that mean the enemy has lost another third-order martial king expert? Chu Nanfeng suddenly thought of the crux of the matter and became somewhat agitated. Xiaoyang nodded as well and said, "The person I killed this time is different from before. This person is the future successor of the White Bear tribe." As soon as he said that, everyone cheered even more. Even the successor of the White Bear tribe had come and died here. This was enough to deal a heavy blow to the enemy. It would let them know that the Four-Realm Alliance was not to be trifled with. As long as the old Prime Minister was sitting there, he frowned deeply. This was because he realized that things were not as simple as they seemed. "I'm afraid that after the White Bear tribe knows about this, they will inevitably do their best to seek revenge. By then, if the Emperor God hasn't come out of seclusion, I'm afraid we won't be able to stop them." Xiaoyang sighed helplessly. Before killing Baiwuxi, he had already thought of such a possibility. However, he had no choice but to do so. Once the drifting cloud boundary's foundation was coveted, it would be an extremely terrifying thing. Therefore, Xiaoyang had no choice but to kill him. As for the consequences, that was a matter for later. Doing so would at least lessen the threat to their foundation. Hearing this, Ji Fei, Shen Wushuang, and the others fell into deep thought. The joy from before was naturally swept away. If the White Bear tribe really did their best to seek revenge, it would be difficult for them to resist. As a result, this matter became a knot in their hearts. Although they were happy for a moment, the consequences were not so easy to bear. Moreover, I've obtained some more accurate information from Bai Wuxi's divine soul. In the Bai tribe, there are 2 4th-level martial emperors. One of them is even breaking through to the 5th level. Xiaoyang took a deep breath and said, as soon as he said that, the shock in everyone's hearts intensified. Although Xiaoyang said that he could kill a 3rd-level martial emperor, what would they do if a 4th-level martial emperor came? Then we'll invite Princess Mingzhu back, the old prime minister said in a low voice. This was the only way the old prime minister could think of. He felt that this matter should be done this way. If the enemy splits their forces again, what about the Sword Heart world? Xiaoyang said helplessly. As soon as he said that, the old prime minister's expression turned extremely ugly. The drifting cloud realm was the first place to bear the brunt of the attack. Wasn't the Sword Heart world the same? No matter which world fell, it was not good news for them. However, they were now in such an awkward position because they lacked top almighties. It could be said that Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu had suffered too much in these 2 worlds. If they could join forces, they would naturally stand a chance against a 4th-level martial emperor. However, reality was cruel sometimes. The 2 of them had to be stationed in different places to maintain the unity of the battle line so that neither place would fall. Now, we can only hope that the Emperor God can come out of his closed-door cultivation soon. The old prime minister sighed helplessly. Now, the only thing that could turn the situation around and boost the morale of the Allied forces was the Emperor God reaching the 4th-level martial emperor. By then, they would barely have the strength to protect themselves and be able to compete with the enemy. However, it was easier said than done. It was not easy to reach that level. Moreover, the Emperor God had been in closed-door cultivation for a long time. However, breaking through to the martial emperor realm was definitely not an easy task. It could be as short as a few months or as long as a few years, decades, centuries, or even thousands of years. Chapter 2289. I'm afraid these things won't happen until some time later. So, let's start with what's in front of us, Xiaoyang said calmly. Everyone also became solemn. Right now, Xiaoyang still had the final say in the matters of the flowing cloud world. Especially in the past few battles, he had shown his foresight and strongest strength. Moreover, every decision he made was extremely wise and could reduce their losses to the minimum. Everyone, rest for 3 days. Since we've shed all pretenses of cordiality, let's kill them all. Xiaoyang looked around and gave the order after checking everyone's condition. Without Bai Wuxi and Bailey Zi, the 2 leaders, the other party was just a pile of loose sand. However, they still needed to kill them all. Otherwise, it wouldn't be good if someone went to spread the news. Since there was an opportunity to kill them all, they naturally had to seize it. In my opinion, there's no need to rest for 3 days. We should make a prompt decision. Now that their forces have not dispersed, we should attack. Moreover, the soldiers on the left and right wings are not injured or tired. They can fight, the old prime minister said. In the old prime minister's opinion, since they had decided to kill them all, there were not so many restrictions. Therefore, it was better to eliminate them as soon as possible so as to avoid any unforeseen circumstances. The old prime minister is right. Our tiredness is nothing. We can grit our teeth and get over it. After we kill them all, we can rest for a few days, Ji Fei said. It could be said that the one who had worked hard last night was Ji Fei, who was controlling the formation. Although he wanted to rest now, for the sake of the overall situation, He felt that attacking now was a great opportunity that could not be missed. That's right. Let's reorganize the army and attack. Chu Nanfeng agreed. For a moment, everyone agreed with the old prime minister's opinion. They did not think that Xiao Yang's opinion was wrong. They just thought that Xiao Gongzhu wanted them to rest more. After they recovered, they could fight again and avoid many casualties. Seeing everyone's enthusiasm, Xiao Yang immediately took out a few bottles of elixirs and said, "Take these and recover your spiritual power quickly. I'll take the lead and kill the 2nd Order Martial King Realm cultivators. You guys can clean up after that." Everyone received the pills and accepted the order. After Xiaoyang said a few words, he quickly turned around and rushed to the enemy's camp. Although Xiaoyang was seriously injured and his spiritual power had not fully recovered, he still moved. Within the same cultivation level, he was almost undefeatable. Therefore, he didn't have so many concerns. After a night of bitter battle, the White Bear tribe returned to their camp and began to reorganize. Moreover, because Bailezi was missing and whether he was dead or alive, and Master White had not given any orders, they stayed where they were and did not dare to move an inch. I wonder how Mr. Bai's plan is going. When the enemy counterattacks, I'm afraid we won't be able to resist, Bai Liguang said worriedly. Bai Yingfeng sneered and said, I wonder how Bailezi is doing now. As soon as he said this, Bai Liguang's expression changed drastically. Instantly, when the two exchanged glances, the flames of war seemed to be on the verge of erupting. At this time, an older martial king immediately stood up and said, You too, now is not the time to argue. The most important thing now is to make a decision. Otherwise, if Xiaoyang comes back and Bailezi is not here, who can stop him? As soon as he said this, Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang were like deflated balloons. They did not continue to be in a deadlock. Even Bailezi had been defeated and fled in a short period of time. Until now, they did not know whether he was dead or alive. How could they dare to be careless? Although they were in the same cultivation level, they did not have the slightest intention to fight. After all, Xiaoyang was someone who had killed several third-level martial emperors. How could they fight against such a powerful person? We'll rest here for half a day. If Mr. Bai does not give the order, we'll retreat to West Wind City and Spring Sun City. We'll rely on the formations we set up earlier to defend ourselves. With this, we won't be afraid of them, Bai Yingfeng said in a low voice. Bai Liguang nodded and said that works. However, as soon as he said this, Bai Liguang immediately felt a great pressure. Immediately, everyone present exchanged glances. Their expressions were full of disbelief, because the pressure they felt came from the opposite side. Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang immediately rushed out and saw Xiaoyang walking over. Xiaoyang held a sword in his hand, which was still dripping with blood. All the White Bear warriors who blocked his way could not withstand the power of his sword and lost their lives. When Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang saw Xiaoyang coming over alone, their legs turned to jelly. Who would have thought that this guy would come back and kill them? Now, in this tent, who could block Xiaoyang's attacks? They knew in their hearts that this was something that no one could do. Didn't Xiaoyang go to find Mr. Bai? Why did he come back so quickly? Bai Liguang said with a trembling voice. At this moment, Bai Yingfeng's face was deathly still. Impossible. With Brother Bai's ability, how could he be defeated? Moreover, he's now a half-step 4th-level martial king. It's impossible for him to lose, Bai Yingfeng said in disbelief. However, the fact that Xiaoyang appeared in this place was already an extremely strange thing. Moreover, reality was so cold and cruel. If it wasn't for the fact that the threat behind them had been completely eliminated, how could Xiaoyang have returned so quickly? Because they couldn't believe it, the originally clear matter had become a huge mystery in their hearts. This was also difficult for them to accept. Activate the formation. An old man suddenly roared in anger. Now in the camp, there was indeed no one who could fight Xiaoyang. However, they had the formation as a foundation. If they worked together, they might have a chance of survival. If they did not do anything, it was no different from waiting for death. After all, who would be willing to die and throw away their own life? In an instant, the martial emperors immediately took action. They activated the formation and prepared to fight to the death with Xiaoyang. That's it. Xiaoyang smiled faintly and shook his head. In the next moment, the formation in the tent shattered with a loud bang. It could not be formed at all. When it shattered, it went berserk, causing many white bear warriors to lose their lives.